Welcome, everyone. I'm Fiona Godlee, Editor-in-Chief of the BMJ, and on behalf of the BMJ, the University of Bristol, the University of Newcastle, welcome to this webinar on herd population immunity. This series of webinars stems from an editorial that George Davey Smith and Marcus Munafo published in the BMJ on the 19th of October last year. It was entitled COVID-19 Known Unknowns. It said that the more certain someone is about COVID-19, the less you should trust them. It expressed concern about the polarization of debates and hardening of positions on key issues, making it hard to make progress. It called on us all to move away from certainty and to respect uncertainty. Acknowledging uncertainty a little more might improve not only the atmosphere of the debate and the science, but also public trust. And that's the spirit of this series of webinars. Today's webinar is, as I say, on population immunity. Previous topics have been children and schools, testing in asymptomatic people, vaccines, zero COVID, new variants, long COVID, COVID and mental health, and vaccination in children. And last time's webinar was on the origins of COVID-19. All of these are available on the BMJ's YouTube channel, where this one will also be posted. The next one will be in January, the topic to be announced. This is being live streamed on BMJ's YouTube channel, youtube.com/thebmj. We've got over 1,100 people registered to join from all around the world, and all of those registered will receive a link to the YouTube video. So please do feel free to share that widely when you get it. We've got some great speakers, great tight timing, and we want this to be as interactive as possible. So please tweet using the hashtag #COVIDunknowns. And please put your questions via the Q&A function, and we will put as many of those as possible to the speakers in the discussion afterwards. So without further ado, let me introduce the first session of this webinar, which is entitled Historical and Contemporary Context of Herd Immunity. And the first speaker in this session is David Robertson from Princeton University. David, over to you.
Thank you. So I'm a doctoral candidate in Princeton University's History of Science program. I have no relevant disclosures or conflicts of interest. Okay. During the novel coronavirus pandemic, the term herd immunity has overwhelmingly been used to describe a threshold or percentage of absolute immunity in a population which, once attained, prevents epidemic growth and may even achieve local elimination. This understanding of the concept, however, is historically relatively recent, emerging in the 1970s as a means to explain the effects of mass vaccination. Prior to this, herd immunity was used for several decades to describe both animal and human diseases for which there existed no vaccines. Today, I want to recapture the broad range of historical meanings and uses this term has carried in the hope of helping us think about different ways to imagine our communities as immune to COVID-19. The earliest published use of the term seems to have been in 1894. Reporting to a veterinary committee on animal nutrition, America's first doctor of veterinary medicine, then employed at the US Department of Agriculture, Daniel Elmer Salmon, noted different disease outcomes in herds of hogs. Those fed a nutritious diet and housed in sanitary conditions seemed resistant to diseases of less well-maintained hogs, even when the different herds met during the day and presumably exchanged pathogens. Salmon argued that, quote, the hardiness and vigor of animals may be aided by intelligent care and by scientific feeding. These facts show something besides individual immunity, he wrote. They demonstrate the possibility of obtaining herd immunity. There is no doubt much still to learn about this subject, but it may be safely assumed that with hygienic surroundings, proper exercise, proper food, and practicing the principles of breeding already enumerated, much can be accomplished in developing animals with more than ordinary power of resisting both sporadic and episodic diseases. In the mid-1910s, the term was used by other veterinarians inside the same bureau of the US Department of Agriculture to understand how to mitigate the disease of brucellosis, or contagious abortion in cattle, a disease for which there was no effective vaccine. Recognizing herd immunity, veterinary scientists discouraged the common practice of destroying cattle infected with the disease in favor of isolating them until they recovered and then reintroducing them into the herd. Because the disease induced immunity, some of which seemed to be passed and inherited by future calves, they recommended using such recovered cattle to build up herd immunity to the disease. While it is tempting to read our own understanding of immunity into these early uses of the term, in fact, it did not mean the same thing in this era. Just as Salmon had written of a resistance to disease in general, so too did veterinarians speak of other contributing factors to herd immunity. Writing in 1920, the veterinarian George Potter encouraged farmers to, quote, build up herd immunity through the selection of prolific, resistant, and immune cows and their offspring. For these pioneers of the concept, herd immunity was not a number nor an overall quantity, nor was it limited to describing animals recovered from previous infection. Rather, it denoted a kind of vital resistance of healthy herds to disease, something that could be cultivated through good diet, breeding, sanitation, and of course, immunity from previous infection. Less than a decade after American veterinarians were writing about herd immunity to contagious abortion, British scientists began applying the term to the study of human infectious disease. British bacteriologists William Topley and Graham Wilson conducted years of experiments on caged mice populations in which they tried to understand the mechanisms of epidemics. Herd immunity was soon recognized as a crucial variable in these experiments. The slaughter of tens of thousands of unfortunate mice led them to produce graphs demonstrating how various proportions of immune and susceptible mice produce different epidemic curves over time. It would be easy to see in this work the now popular idea of a herd immunity threshold, or a quantity of immune individuals which, once reached, prevents further epidemic growth. Crucially, however, Topley and Wilson emphasized the distribution of resistance to disease among their mice, rather than simply an overall quantity. In 1923, the first time herd immunity was written of in a medical journal, they asked this insightful question. Assuming a given total quantity of resistance against a specific bacterial parasite to be available among a considerable population, in what way should that resistance be distributed among the individuals at risk so as best to ensure against the epidemic spread of the disease? From such experiments, the pair insisted that, quote, the question of immunity as an attribute of a herd should be studied as a separate problem, closely related to, but in many ways distinct from, the problem of the immunity of an individual host. As historians have shown, the early 20th century witnessed challenges to this singular scientific focus on pathogens in the causation of disease. Rather, scientists sought to include the role of the host population and environment in which pathogens spread. In this intellectual context, herd immunity became a basic concept in the emergence of disease ecology, the effort to study the dynamic interactions between host, parasite, and environment, and the processes which produced an equilibrium between these competing forces. Herd immunity quickly became a go-to tool of early disease ecologists studying the seasonal fluctuations of endemic pathogens like measles and diphtheria. But today I want to turn to the role of herd immunity in understanding a disease that some may find surprising given discussion over the last 2 years. That is influenza. Beginning in the 1940s, influenza epidemics were commonly understood as arising from a loss of herd immunity. In 1953, British virologist Christopher Andrews, then head of the World Influenza Centre overseen by the WHO, noted the relationship between the rapid mutation of influenza and the adaptability of its host population's immunity. Over a period of years, he wrote in the WHO's bulletin, variations may be played upon one antigenic theme, but after some time, the possibilities will be exhausted. The herd will be generally resistant to closely related variants, and the introduction of a new motif will be necessary to keep things alive, end quote. Later that decade, during the flu pandemic of 1957, American microbiologist and vaccinologist Maurice Hilleman explained that following mutation of the influenza virus, quote, there is a loss of herd immunity because the population has not encountered this virus nor anything sufficiently similar to it to develop immunities, end quote. Influenza pandemics were understood to fizzle out over numerous seasonal waves as herd immunity accumulated in the population and the virus became endemic. Smaller seasonal epidemics became the mechanism by which herd immunity was replenished, preventing larger future outbreaks by limiting the buildup of susceptible hosts in a population. In this understanding of the concept, antigenic drift and shift were the mechanisms by which influenza overcame the accrual of herd immunity within populations, keeping the survival possibilities of the virus alive. Indeed, herd immunity remains a common way of understanding the dynamics of freely circulating pathogens like influenza, RSV, and other coronaviruses to this day, explaining the limits on transmission availed by ongoing exposure. As Maurice Hilleman wrote as late as 2004, quote, influenza viruses travel rapidly and induce herd immunity, forcing the pathogen to adapt its mode of infection, end quote. It was not until after the Second World War that herd immunity started to become closely tied to the targeted outcome of mass vaccination, that is, as a herd immunity threshold. With the expansion of mass vaccination in the post-war era, efforts began to tie herd immunity to discrete parameters that could inform mass vaccination campaigns. In 1970, then Dean of the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, Charles Smith, published a simple model attempting to capture the parameters of vaccination necessary to control a disease in a population. Smith's model depicted a pathogen's R naught on the y-axis and the degree of immunity in a population on the x-axis. Where these intersected constituted a threshold for a given pathogen to be controlled. Other scientists were immediately critical of the model, pointing out, for example, that it assumed a population that mixed randomly, when in reality, all populations have their own unique and complex contact networks shaping transmission. By the 1980s, epidemiologists and disease modelers were attempting to account for the complexity of real populations in their models of herd immunity. The most prolific of these, disease modelers Robert May and Roy Anderson, then at Imperial College London, emphasized the importance of accounting for, quote, the precise course of infection within an individual, the demography of the host population, the duration of acquired immunity and maternally derived protection, age-related changes in the degree and intimacy of contacts among people, and the prevailing levels of genetic, spatial, and behavioral heterogeneity and susceptibility and resistance to infection. Despite the emergence of a herd immunity threshold, the complexity of real populations remained a concern of epidemiologists and disease modelers. So to conclude, herd immunity has always been much more than a number. Since its origins in the late 19th century, it has offered an explanatory mechanism for the collective dynamics of infectious disease, demonstrating that population protections are not reducible to the aggregate of immune individuals, i.e. an immune population is greater than the sum of its immune individuals. The origins of herd immunity do not lie in vaccination, nor does the term only refer to vaccination today. Scientists continue to use the term to understand so-called natural epidemics like Zika, as well as endemic respiratory pathogens such as influenza and respiratory syncytial virus. The need for clarity. When we speak of herd immunity for COVID-19, do we mean herd immunity against infection or against disease or severe disease? Do we mean it will be eliminated from a population or that it will become endemic like the other human coronaviruses? Historically, all these outcomes and many others have been referred to as herd immunity. Finally, recognizing that herd immunity is much more than a number or a threshold may allow us to ask larger social questions about how we must continue to live alongside infectious diseases. How can we obtain the most effective and egalitarian quantity and distribution of immunity in our communities, locally, nationally, and globally? In terms of COVID-19, should we boost entire populations in high-income countries while people in low-income countries continue to die from a vaccine-preventable disease? Should we vaccinate/boost children and people already recovered from coronavirus? Historically, herd immunity has helped us answer such questions, but thinking about it exclusively as a number or a threshold to be reached over the last 2 years has arguably distracted us from these equally important questions. Thank you, and if you'd like to know more, there was another slide that it's not showing. You can read my article recently published in American Journal of Public Health.
David, thank you so much. You have effectively, if you could stop sharing now, nailed so many of the controversial issues in this whole topic. People frightened of the term herd immunity because of all the reasons we know, and the difference between natural and vaccination, and the business about whether it's against infection or against disease. That was really a wonderful beginning to our webinar. Thank you so much. I'd now like to introduce George Davey-Smith, who is at Bristol University, is going to talk about immune ecology. George.
Thanks very much, Fiona, and thanks, David, for that fantastic first talk. So as David discussed, at the turn of the 20th century, there was considerable optimism about the course of dealing with infectious disease. And this was reflected by the epidemiologist Major Greenwood, who was the leading epidemiologist of the time in the UK and the first professor of epidemiology at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, writing in Nature that in 1916, that epidemiology was going to extract itself from its humiliating position as a plaything of the bacteriologists and public health officials. And he talked about the work of Sir Ronald Ross, the mathematical modelling work of Sir Ronald Ross on malaria, and of John Brownlee on influenza, and the predictions that Brownlee was making about the periodicities of influenza, that this was going to elevate epidemiology to the rank of a distinctive science. Following that, optimistic assessment, of course, the influenza pandemic of 1918 came as something of a shock. And writing only 4 years later in his report for the government on the 1920 on the 1918 flu pandemic, Greenwood had lowered the expectations to saying that such calculations, although of very limited value, are not entirely worthless. And by 1946, he had gone on to full grumpy old man mode to say that even when medical statistical data were abundant, epidemiological prophecy was a dangerous business, and now is a mere exercise in tendentious rhetoric. Topley, William Topley, who David also discussed, was during the war, saw catastrophic epidemics, and he considered that epidemiology was little better than a blend of folklore and mythology, only to be transformed into science by turning it into a branch of experimental biology. What was known about infections in humans and in non-human animals was that there were long-term carriers of infectious agents. So some infectious agents would just persist in individuals, like typhoid Mary being the obvious example, but many such agents could persist. But there was also a large amount of asymptomatic disease. That was the corollary of that was there was much latent immunization, that people were becoming immunized through infection where that wasn't recognized. And importantly, that infection isn't the same as the disease. You can be infected without being sick. The hundreds of thousands of mice that David mentioned were sacrificed. Those experiments, firstly, the major conclusion from them was there was massive interstudy variation. It was very difficult to predict what was going to happen when you even standardized the conditions, so everything appeared to be the same. The epidemics in these mouse colonies would be very different. So much of it was stochastic and could not be explained. But they did come to the conclusion that the infectious dose, the amount of the agent that the mice got at the time they were infected had a major effect on the outcome for the individual mice, that immunization was protective, but that immunized animals could often still carry and spread the agents, that when the immunized or survivors of infection became infected, they're often asymptomatic or they have less disease. There was generally constant strain of agent within epidemics, but then the change between them. And that pre-existing immunity accommodates to an extent to the changing strain. As David mentioned, it was Topley and Wilson reporting on some of those early experiments that introduced to the academic field the notion of herd immunity. Now, if they'd actually followed on from the experimental animal they were using, which was a mouse, the collective name is mischief. So maybe if this had been called mischief immunity rather than herd immunity, there would have been different consequences for its history. Greenwood pointed out that, that the sample sizes they were using, 1,000 mice per epidemic, might sound a lot, but if you're studying the herd or the group and the immunity within a group, then the 1,000 individuals just represented one experimental data point. So that the group nature of the characteristic was clear. And Topley discussed how both individual and herd immunity were relative concepts. If the infectious dose was made massive, it didn't matter if the animal had been immunized or had been previously infected. You could still get serious disease and death. And the level of immunity within the population, the collective immunity of a population, was also a relative concept, a relative construct in terms of the exposure, which was going to influence what was happening within the population. So these are relative concepts, we're not seen as threshold concepts. Amongst humans, the leading researcher was Sheldon Dudley, who carried out groundbreaking studies in schools. This was the hospital school at Greenwich, but he studied groups in other schools. There was, and the MRC in the end set up a large set of studies in schools. And in this environment, he could very well characterize quantitatively the level of immunity in the group, how outbreaks occurred, and the dynamics of those, and how those dynamics related to what happened when new arrivals arrived in the group, etc. The titles of Dudley's papers all over the years reflect his ecological perspective. He was talked about the carrier issue, the fact that the disease could be carried long term and remain immunizing to others. He wrote papers on herds and individuals, on the human adaptation to the parasitic environment, and also how the parasites adapted to the human, as the human being part of their environment. The latent immunization and seasoning of troops, yellow fever as an ecological problem, and the ecological outlook on epidemiology, in which he stated scientific epidemiology is medical ecology. The ecological view of infectious disease and immunity is one based on the notion of ecology as the study of the relationships between the living organisms and each other, including humans, and their physical environment. And the leading popularizer of this approach was the future Nobel Prize-winning immunologist and microbiologist Macfarlane Burnet, who wrote many reviews and then a very popular book on this topic. He stopped using the archaic form of ecological as he went on. And Burnet's examples of this ranged from a huge number of issues that he discussed, but psittacosis in parrots, for example. He discussed how in stable communities, when the parrots are infected very early in life, there's no evident disease, and disease only occurs when there's serious disruption of the parrot communities, and then they pass the disease onto humans. He discovered that asymptomatic infection in vast numbers of parrots, that yellow fever, that when everyone gets it at early life, there is later not serious disease. And influenza, he discussed colds and many other infectious diseases. Dudley indeed coined the term Burnet's law, talking about the notion that when in endemic areas, when a virus is ubiquitous and infects infants and young children, it only causes mild or unapparent clinical infections followed by immunity, and that when in the new disease, when it's first introduced and the adults have not been infected from childhood, it causes serious illness. The immunologist Cedric Mims wrote very nicely a nice paper on how viruses view us, basically, how viruses will not cause serious disease when they have reached an ecological steady state with humans. So the implications of an ecological thinking about immunity are that individual and population immunity are relative concepts, and they often do not lead to the abolition of infection at individual and population level, but they reduce its adverse consequences. The consequences of infection change as individual and group immunity change with vaccination and circulating infection, such as the infectious fatality rate for SARS-CoV-2 in a Scottish linkage study in those who've been immunised is less than 0.1%. So that's changed from when the virus first arrived. Individual immunity adapts to an extent to the changing microbiological characteristics of the circulating virus. Age at initial infection is a key influence on consequences of many infections. And the relative aspect of herd immunity problematizes the notion of herd immunity thresholds. And finally, that environmental changes, perhaps consequent on one infection, will influence infection by an immunity to other agents, such as we're possibly seeing now, that the consequences of reduced social contacts, etc., that people have longer gaps between normally mild infections and might get more serious symptomatology.
Fantastic.
Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, George. Sorry, there's an echo. Not that I can do anything about that. Thank you so much. I was just thinking mischief of mice, and the collective noun for epidemiologists, which I'm sure you know, is an outbreak of epidemiologists. So anyone's got any better suggestions, that's the first one I could find on Google. Thanks very much, George. Moving on then to our third speaker, Mark Honigsbaum at City University, who's going to talk about herd, spelt differently, in Whitehall, from swine flu to COVID-19. Over to you, Mark. Mark, you may be on mute. I can't hear you. Don't know if others can.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes. I can hear you now. Lovely,
brilliant.
Thank you.
See my screen. I was just saying thank you very much, Fiona, for inviting me, and George. It's great to hear you talking about some of the figures that I've studied, Burnett in particular. So the title of my talk is Herd in Whitehall, HEARD, from swine flu to COVID-19. And I'm glad you asked me to talk about this, because when I was writing my book, The Pandemic Century, at one point I considered including a chapter on swine flu, but didn't, because of course, although it was technically a pandemic, it wasn't a very severe pandemic. And I think what I'm hoping to do now is explain how I think that played into what happened in the first months of the UK response. And to do that, I'm going to go back to the report that the Welsh CMO, Dame Deirdre Hein, gave when she was asked to look into, you know, what went well and what didn't go so well during the H1 swine flu. And one of the things she singled out, she used very careful language, but still she singled out the sharing of what she called worst case scenarios and warned against the over-reliance on disease models. And in particular, she singled out Imperial College's reasonable worst case assumptions. So from memory, I think this was in July 2009, when Sir Liam Donaldson, the then English CMO, shared this projection in Parliament and saying that we could see as many as 65,000 deaths from H1N1 swine flu if we, you know, didn't take it seriously and mobilize local networks of, you know, public health. In the event, of course, the UK suffered just 457 deaths from swine flu. So, of course, that was, in retrospect, seen as an overreaction. She also pointed out to an obvious gap between what the government was saying and what was observable to ordinary people on the ground, namely that the disease was mild in most cases and that mortality levels were low. So if you think back to that period, and I recall it vividly, the NHS set up a sort of a hotline, and I think on the first day that it was mobilized, it crashed because so many people panicked that they overwhelmed that hotline. And then people very quickly started, once they realized that the disease was far milder than they'd been led to believe, they started joking about maybe we should have swine flu parties and, you know, just get naturally immunized. The Daily Mail was particularly critical of the fact that in the run-up to the pandemic, the UK and other governments had placed sleeping contracts with vaccine manufacturers. You know, so these were guarantees of payments in return for which they would fast-track emergency vaccines. I believe the BMJ also did a couple of exposures of this, looking at the so-called conflicts of interest on the WHO committees that reviewed these arrangements. And so you can see that the Daily Mail labeled it as the pandemic that never was. This is a cartoon which I think absolutely captures the sort of popular view in retrospect of you can see on the left, the sort of perhaps malingering patient, and on the right, you know, the pharmaceutical industry laying on a sun chair, reaping the benefits of this kind of what was seen as a false pandemic, a false panic. So coming up to what happened during the early months of the UK's response to the coronavirus. I'm a member of the Social History of Medicine, and we participated in a round table on what, if any, contributions historians can make in pandemic responses. Of course, there were no historians on SAGE or NERVTAG. Sorry, let's go back. So she argues that the experience of swine flu really scarred, coloured, the whole approach in Whitehall, and it became the sort of internalized history that civil servants turned to. And she made the point that politicians and civil servants were using their folk knowledge. I think this is important. I mean, they weren't turning to scientists or experts. They were drawing on their own experience. And 2009 wasn't that long ago. What happened during swine flu? And also, with swine flu, the initial pandemic response was contact tracing, closing of schools, and use of antivirals. All these things had to be abandoned because they couldn't be sustained effectively. And people became fearful in Whitehall that it was all counterproductive. So turning to the coronavirus pandemic itself, I'd just written a book called The Pandemic Century, which drew on something like 10 years of research into the history of disease ecology. Like many people, when I saw what happened in China, I thought, well, this could be, the feared big pandemic we've all been expecting, but we were unsure at that point. But when the virus exploded in Lombardy in northern Italy, and we saw elderly patients flooding, emergency room, it was absolutely clear to me that we needed to wake up and take it seriously. And the reason that weekend sticks out is that 2 days later, I was invited onto the Jeremy Vine show. So Jeremy Vine is a popular broadcaster, you all know, Radio 2. I was on that show with Hugh Pym. Hugh Pym had just come from a briefing at the Department of Health. And the first thing Jeremy Vine said to me was, well, first of all the producers wanted to shake my hand. And I said, I'm not shaking hands. And the second thing was that Jeremy Vine and other people said, well, it's all a bit of hysteria and it's just like swine flu. Hugh Pym had just come from this briefing. At this time, there was no plan to cancel Premier League football matches, although Italy immediately cancelled matches and instituted a 2-meter distancing rule. The advice at the time from the Department of Health was it's fine for matches to go ahead and we only need to keep 1 meter apart. At which point I said to Hugh Pym, have you ever been to a football match? Have you ever been through a turnstile? Have you ever had someone shouting in your eardrums? This is not practical. We know now in retrospect that actually, there was a concerted, this was what was going on. So I can't actually prove this, but I think that, there was a kind of a received wisdom, if you like, in these sort of political and establishment circles. But then we saw from the 11th of March, I'm not going to go through all this in detail, we had this idea that herd immunity was raised in interviews on the BBC, first by David Halpern, then on the 13th of March, Sir Patrick Vallance certainly gave the impression, although he denied it subsequently, that he was advocating a herd immunity response. He insisted that actually the strategy was to flatten the curve and shield the elderly, but I'm not sure there's really much of a distinction. John Edmonds, George Davey has pointed out, this extraordinary interview he gave on Channel 4. The one I watched actually was the same evening when Graham Medley went on to Newsnight to advocate a nice big epidemic to generate herd immunity. And then he went on, he shared this sort of fantasy idea he had of let's put all the vulnerable people in the north of Scotland and keep them there and put all the young people in Kent and let them mix and get infected. So we can see that this was certainly the train of thought that people were going along. We also, of course, have the testimony of Dominic Cummings. We have to be cautious about this, but on this point, I believe what he says implicitly. He claimed that Boris Johnson regarded COVID as just a scare story. He described it specifically as the new swine flu and joked about getting Chris Whitty to inject him with it live on TV. We don't have to take his word for it. The Sunday Times Insight team did a very good investigation, which they subsequently published as Failures of State. And around this time, their sources in Downing Street were briefing them that there was this message, there was always this message coming straight down of, we've all got to get it. And this source went on. I remember having a conversation about how I don't like this, and this is a chicken pox party thing. So, you know, these common tropes of swine flu parties, chicken pox parties, measles parties.
1 minute, Mark.
Okay, so just very quickly, Neil Ferguson made the point that prior to this pandemic, nobody really thought that suppression of a disease was an option in the middle world. In the modern world, China could do it, but we couldn't do this in the West. But he subsequently acknowledged that his models, the mitigation scenario was synonymous with the acquisition of herd immunity. And this is something I go into in more detail in case you're interested in a paper just published in Interface Focus, Imagining Pandemics Now and Then. So very quickly, of course, the House of Commons Health and Select Committee, their report also made the point that this was not an inadvertent policy, it was deliberate, and in practice amounted to accepting that herd immunity was an inevitable outcome. So just very quickly to conclude, and why I regret not including a chapter on swine flu, it seems to me that scientists, like generals, are always fighting the last epidemic. And I think that swine flu was the epidemic experience they drew upon. The result of this was that policy choices were framed in a very binary way. It was either herd immunity or lockdowns. There was nothing between. Ferguson actually admitted the limitations of his model, saying that its accuracy depended on how people responded to lockdowns and whether populations might adopt social distancing spontaneously. But nobody really devoted much time to thinking about this or considering whether we should go for more targeted interventions. And this really, I think, is the imaginative failure that lies at the heart of the government's response. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Mark. So now we know where we should have had historians on the advisory committees. It would have made a huge difference to some of the wisdom that we could have applied to this pandemic. Thank you very much, Mark. Moving now then to Thomas House, who is going to talk about herd immunity thresholds. Is it a useful concept?
Oh, yes, I've just been teaching. I didn't get to check my slides. Can I just check, is that all working for everyone?
Perfect.
I assume the right kind of people will shout at me if it isn't. I've just run from giving it a tutorial. Okay, so why model? We've just had all the reasons why models are terrible, but there's this classic quote from I am a modeler for my sins. I was teaching people about mathematical methods. We've had this great quote by George Bach, they're all wrong. Of course, we all know they're wrong, but some are useful. And I've given some examples here. When you model, quite often people set up a household budget. I think this is a really good one, really good example, because you're trying to say to yourself, well, can I eat less avocados and then afford to buy a house? Well, a lot of millennials ran that calculation and worked out that even if the price of avocados fluctuates quite a lot, it's not the right amount of money involved, right? So we model that quite regularly. A lot of lab biologists who are, we've just heard, think the mouse is a model of other kinds of organism and particularly humans. People who are train enthusiasts run models. They want to manipulate things that you can't, unless you get to be head of a train operating company, you can't manipulate. Train to yourself. So models are kind of an integral part of things we do in science. I'm just going to say quickly how these were used. There were 3 ways they were used. This full fact article was great. We use them for working out what the R value is now, so what's called situational awareness, seeing what happens if we project forward for a few weeks. And then also these longer term scenarios, which are very much what if. Everything apart from one is a what if, right? The 2 is a kind of, these medium term projections are more of a what if where we want to be held to it. And the 3 is really, is much more like the person with, what if I decided to reroute the trains, right? Well, someone might not reroute them. And a feature of, this is my kind of joke for the mathematicians. So, commentator I says, the problem with the UK's pandemic response was too much modelling. We should have just done XI, right? So this means X depends on the commentator. And there's some set of things, big X, which we could have done. And the set of things people suggest we do is very large. And no commentator can agree on what we obviously should have done, unless they're the same commentator or friends. So we have people going, oh, the problem was too much modelling. We should never have done what we did. We should have locked down much harder and earlier and done exactly what Turkmenistan or South Korea did. Or some people go, too much modelling, we should have done just what Sweden did, and you know, taken it loose. And people have invoked this, and the sheer number of statements that have followed. Oh, too much modelling, we should have done this, and you know, and that's not to say, of course, that humanities aren't terribly important. It isn't terribly interesting to hear all this stuff about history, but we don't say this about other sciences, right? We know that the people, you know, if the people who are calculating doses of anaesthetic or working out whether a plane is safe to fly or whatever have done some quantitative work. This is how we do science. It's how the modern world works, and our lives depend on this kind of quantitative thinking. So I don't understand why there's such hostility to this. And I really welcome further discussion on this. These are supposed to be, I guess, quite boisterous events where we have a good thrashing of these things out. I think the main thing I can see is where people get sniffy about maths is where it impacts on politics. And people don't, we're not a country where we expect people to learn any significant maths after being a teenage. So most of the people who've gone and run the country maybe potentially feel that because they can't do the maths, it's probably not important, I would say. But despite that, it has long been noted that mathematics is unreasonably effective, as Wigner pointed out. And interestingly, Weinberg also said that sort of philosophy and these other things are almost unreasonably ineffective. And again, these are kind of points for discussion. So what is herd immunity? It's got a great history. Whenever you heard Graham Medley or John Edmonds or me or anyone else talking about it, we meant this rather simple-minded thing, which is there's an R0, that's how many people you're going to infect on average early in the pandemic before we do anything. And say early on, that might have been about 3 for COVID, right? So here's a person at the R0, they infect 3 people, each of those infects 3 people, right? And now suppose later on there's some immunity, either naturally or vaccine acquired, so that each person's only infecting 1 person, right? And I don't know if you can see the arrow there, right? So this person infects 1 person, they don't infect another 2 because these 2 people have got enough resistance or whatever you want to call it, but somehow it's changed it so the average is now 1. And then there should be a load of people here who got infected but didn't. And that's what we mean by herd immunity. It's just that's what any modeler meant when they set up and meant it. We were ignorant of all the history, any association with cows or anything else. We just meant this, right? And I think it would be really nice if we could acknowledge that that's just what a simple-minded modelers meant, right? And not say that there was any association with this sort of history that we maybe largely didn't know, right? And I think that's a simple concept. And the point is that the reason you can then use R0 to work out what proportion of people are required to be immune to hit this herd immunity threshold by saying it's 1. We need the number of susceptibles to be 1 divided by R0. Yeah. So because R0's 3, it's 3 people. You need 2 out of those 3 to be immune for it just to be 1, then 1, then 1 in a chain, right? And as soon as you've got more than that, it's going to be less than 1 and less than 1, and the epidemic's going to die off. Okay, so just a very quick blast through modelling. Of course, this is in Matt Keeling and Pedro Harney's great textbook on this. You have this tremendous complexity going on with the pathogen and the host and all this other stuff. And what we do is the models do typically start by boxing people, right? We group people, otherwise you're not doing epidemiology, you're doing a set of case studies. So we somehow have to have ways of grouping people. We say the susceptibles and infectives interact, and then they make people who are latently infected, that's the E, and the new infected goes off and keeps infecting. Then the people who are latently infected become infectious and infected, and then those infectious and infected eventually recover. We write down these kind of differential equations, which is when people start getting, I think this is where the sniffiness starts, because people go, right, it's been a while since I did those, or I never did advanced GCE or whatever, but these are related to prevalence and incidence, right? Things that we measure, right? So they predict, and they show how these things drive each other. And the point is this Kermack and McKendrick's model that represented this was kind of the first modern understanding of how infections work, right? It was getting rid of the miasma theory, right? And getting rid of the idea that somehow pathogens attenuated, right? So each viral particle that goes through the population is very similar. People used to think the virus would sort of come out of animals or come out of bad smells, and somehow the reason that we saw epidemics come and go was an attenuation of the pathogen. It got kind of weaker. This mathematical thinking gave us our modern understanding that no, each viral particle is pretty similar, modulo evolution, and it's the immunity in the population that causes epidemics to come and go, right? Through this flip-flopping between prevalence and incidence. So I'm now going to drop the E class I'm going to talk about the SIR model. I've provided code for anyone who would like to play with the code. I very much believe in open science and so on. And I'd like to talk about the way this lets us think about epidemics. So free fall epidemic. Here we've got prevalence of infection with the red curve on the left. Then we see that infection growing and shrinking reduces the pool of susceptibles. And then we've got this more complex picture on the right-hand side, which is showing the susceptibles against the prevalence as we go on, yeah? And what we see is that when it passes this 1/R0 herd immunity threshold, that's when the prevalence goes down. That's the peak of the epidemic, right? And when people say, what was there any other outcome besides herd immunity? With our naive, non-historical modelers way of thinking, what that meant is we are going to end up to the left of that dotted line. And there is no country in the world that is not going to end up on the left of that dotted line. That is a fact, and we knew that in January. Okay, January 2020. There was simply, Neil Ferguson said that. Everyone said that. This is the absolute scientific consensus. It is that's what people meant when they said that. Okay.
1 minute, Thomas.
Oh yeah, sure. So this is what happens when you vaccinate in that model, and what you see is you can reduce the impact, right? If we could vaccinate 1% of the population per day. There have been other historians who say, well, the problem with these models is they're one shot, but you can add this waning immunity, and what you see is the herd immunity threshold is still useful because it's the thing that the kind of seasonal dynamics oscillate around. So this is a bit like what something like RSV is doing now. And the first talk really got this right with the, saying that, yes, we say that each year RSV hits herd immunity and we lose it. And it's very, very important not to, a lot of people have gone back to these pre-scientific ideas of, well, it's herd immunity isn't due to natural infection. And then, well, that would have been very dangerous if they'd been listened to, because we wouldn't have been able to explain the resurgent RSV we have now that's been filling up pediatric hospital beds. Then with annual boosters, you see you can change this by shifting the oscillation to somewhere a bit lower down and less severe. Okay, so I'm really going to blast through these. Sorry, I've mistimed it. But one of the things that worried us early on as modelers was there's so many examples where we overreact, right? And there was this really classic Anderson and May paper that said we shouldn't have just gone for whapping out as much vaccine against rubella as possible, because you can actually drive up cases of congenital rubella syndrome. And that was very, very nearly seen, right? We saw this very sharp increase in the age of infection and the driving of rubella infection into people at the age where they became pregnant, even more case in the developing world, right? So just this, we've got to do something, look at all this rubella, that's something's better than nothing. This is very, very often not true. And what was worrying people early on was the idea, well, we haven't, exactly what Neil Ferguson was quoted as saying in the last talk, we haven't tried to suppress before, but we knew it was going to take years. And so if you assume you have a finite budget for non-pharmaceutical interventions, then you're better off not going too early, right? This is, again, very, very uncontroversial. And what was kind of the reason the modelers went out and got it in the neck was that the kind of, they were going on that thing, well, we were sort of going on that thing we've been told that you've only got so long, and how are we going to do it? And I do think this discourse issue that in many ways, the public has been denied a discussion about what a realistic prognosis for pandemic by this sort of ill-informed grandstanding, borderline conspiracy theoretic thinking about what was going on. Graham's letter to the Lancet really tried to sort this out. What he was saying in that interview, this important technical terms, we should be able to explain them and what we mean by them without being accused of wanting to let it rip or so on. It was I think, very unfortunate that we're this far in, and very few people who were using these terms and were sort of sent out as not very media trained and so on, people to try and explain this got it in the neck so badly. So thank you very much,
Thomas. Wow. Well, I think you've proved exactly why there is hostility to modelling, because it's incredibly complex, but also, along with historians, we need more mathematically literate people on our advisory group. So thank you very much indeed. Really, really fascinating talk, with which I'm going to hand on now to Alison Pollock, who's going to chair the next session. Alison.
Thanks very much. So we'll move swiftly on, and I'm delighted to introduce Professor Bach, and he's going to talk about the biological processes underlying population immunity. Over to you, Professor Bach.
Yes, thank you. What I would like to do in this short presentation is to present the point of view of an immunologist on herd immunity. But before doing this, I think it is worthwhile presenting the components of the immune response to SARS-CoV-2. And this slide shows you that there are two distinct phases. The first one is that of innate immunity, and the second one of adaptive immunity. Now, the first one is very important, not so well studied. We know that it involves the production of interferon alpha, type 1 interferon, NK cells. Now, the importance of that innate immunity is outlined by the fact that people showing very severe forms of the disease may, in the 10% of cases or so, present mutations in the interferon type 1 gene or present antibodies to interferon alpha, so which is important for the discussion. Now, the second phase, that of adaptive immunity, involves antibodies and T cells. As far as antibodies are concerned, there is a lot of data, of course. We know that there are different classes. There may be IgM, there are IgM, then IgG, but also IgA. And these IgA antibodies, which are produced locally in the mucosa, respiratory mucosa, are very significant in terms of the role for protective, protection from transmission, on which we shall come back in a moment. The antibodies may have different specificity. We are particularly interested in those directed against the spike protein, the S protein, but there are other proteins to which antibodies are directed. These antibodies can be neutralizing, which is of course a favorable possibility, but also not neutralizing. The level is variable from patient to patient. It is a very important problem because we never know in a given case what is the level of antibodies if we don't test it, and we shall see later that it's not that easy to propose biological markers of antibody immunization. And lastly, of course, and we shall come back to that rapidly, the duration of antibodies production varies a lot from patient to patient. The more severe, the longer the immunization, the antibody production, but this is not an absolute fact. Now, if we come back to T cells, and first, before showing that, I would like to emphasize the fact that the viral load is very important, it's a major one at the beginning of the infection and then rapidly disappears. It may be followed by cytokine storm and different immunological features which may lead to very severe forms, eventually lethal. But rapidly, when viral load has decreased, immunity appears with two facet antibodies, as I said, and T cells. Now, T cells, as everyone knows, are of two types, CD4 and CD8. CD4 helper T cells, which help antibody production, and T cells of the cytotoxic type, which will destroy infected cells. Now, these T cells can be measured, can be evaluated in the lab. It's not as easy as antibodies. We have done it with Lucien Chatou in our lab. We have done it using an ELISpot assay. The principle is relatively simple. I will not go into the details. You put on microplate interferon gamma, and then you add the lymphocytes. You add the peripheral blood cells of patients that you want to test for antibodies, and then you evaluate the production of gamma interferon with an anti-gamma interferon antibody. So this will give you the possibility to assess the production, the presence of antigen-specific T cells against the various virus proteins. On the left panel, you can see that COVID patients show much higher levels, frequency of S protein reactive T cells than normal controls. And this is true also on the top level of the right panel. You can see that for other proteins, you also see important differences. Now, something very important to mention, which could be done for antibodies as well, that when you look at vaccination, you only look at S protein directed antibodies. There are no antibodies directed against other proteins since the vaccine is made of the S protein. Interestingly, when one looks at the reactivity to antigens of the common coronaviruses, there is no cross-reactions. And this is something to note because it excludes the fact that some resistance could be due possibly to previous exposure to common coronaviruses. Now, there is a last aspect of the immune response to SARS-CoV-2, and this is antigen-specific memory. It is well known that the immune system develops memory to antigens to which it has been exposed, and this is the case for SARS-CoV-2, for COVID-19. And this is true at the B cell level and the T cell level. And why is it so important? It is important because in people without detectable antibodies or without detectable T cells, people may still be protected because of memory. When they have memory, as soon as the virus is presented again to the patient, then very rapidly the patient will make high affinity antibodies much more rapidly than he would do for a first infection. And this is reassuring in a way because it tells us that that disappearance of antibodies may not necessarily mean that no protection is still present. Now, concerning protection, I would like to emphasize the fact that one should distinguish the immune response to the virus and the protection induced by the virus through the immune response. The protection is defined by the capacity of the individual to resist to a second exposure to the infectious agent. And this is, of course, a crucial fact for the epidemiological point of view. Now, we have no way of associating directly protection to a given marker among those that I have just presented. Now, speaking of herd immunity, I would not go into the details of the mathematical formula that have been discussed previously. I would like to emphasize two things. First is the fact that these formulas, this approach is based on panmixia. It supposes that patients are exposed to random contacts and have a similar behavior towards the virus, which is not the case. And if we go further in the discussion of the factors which can alter the immune response or the protection, more importantly, to the virus, there is a very long list that we have to discuss in some detail because it's central to our discussion this afternoon. Well, the first element which could interfere is spontaneous resistance to the virus. It is well known that in families, typically, sometimes there is one case, two cases, and 2 or 3 other members of the families are not affected. They are PCR negative, they have no symptoms, they have not been infected. This is difficult to explain. It could be due to very efficient innate immunity. It could be due to other factors. If we refer to HIV, for example, there are people with a mutation in the CCR5 gene, which is a chemokine receptor, who are not susceptible to HIV because the CCR5 is a receptor for the virus. So there are many possible explanations, and we don't really know what is the percentage of spontaneously resistant people. And this is a very important factor. Another variable is the remission, is the duration of remission. Duration of remission is something which has been studied for decades for many infectious agents. There are these situations in which typically a vaccine may provide long life, whole life protection. This is the case for yellow fever, but for many other diseases, one has to go into recall injections to maintain immunity and increase it. In fact, the second injection will provide you with a better immunity than the first one, and the third one better than the second one, which is well illustrated nowadays. So this is an important factor. There is another one which has been discussed although we don't have very precise data, is the effect of the immune response on transmission. And this is, of course, a crucial factor for our discussion. It is known that presently, with a very contagious virus that we have now, there is the effect on transmission is not perfect. There is transmission of the virus by people being immune, vaccinated, or having shown natural disease, or even, that is the best situation, natural disease, and then vaccination. And so this is, it has, as I said, a strong biological basis, and this is the IgA antibodies produced in the respiratory, in the bronchial. But we don't know if the present data indicates that there is a partial effect on transmission, but not complete. Now, the fourth point is, of course, well known to all of us, and this is the appearance of variants, which may eventually be more contagious than the previous, the initial virus, and this will modify completely the picture, and this has to be taken into account. There are other factors which are interested to consider. The first one is that of super contaminators, people with a very high virus load who will contaminate a large number of people, indicating that it's not just a random contact as in the herd immunity hypothesis. The immunity hypothesis being based on the mathematical model, supposedly in its initial form, having the concept, supporting the concept of equal exposure to the virus. So this is a super contaminator, but similarly, we can also mention the case of high promiscuity populations, typically in some cities, notably when the socio-economical level is low. And this is very different from what we see in people in the countryside or in countries like Scandinavia, Norway, or other countries with a much less dense population. Yes, I'm nearly finished. And then it's finished by saying that there is also the problem of the season. So to conclude, I would say that the concept of herd immunity is a very important one for epidemiology, and also for policy of vaccination. There is no way of proposing a really useful biological marker today. In fact, the best indicator of what is the situation in a given population is the epidemiological data, which tells us in a way that probably the herd immunity level that we should try to reach today is about 70, 80%, relatively close to that of measles, which is 90, 95%, which is in a way disappointing, but in fact, we are not so far from it in the well-vaccinated countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was beautifully clear for everybody. If we can move on now to Ben Lopman, who's going to talk about frameworks for measuring population immunity. Thank you, Ben.
Yes, thank you. And I'm an epidemiologist, so I'm going to follow on from that nice talk by Dr. Bach about kind of immunological perspectives, and I'm going to take a epidemiologist perspective on how we measure population immunity. And I'll finish with some thoughts about kind of managing population immunity, because I think that we are getting into the territory now where achieving any kind of herd immunity threshold is not realistic and not what we should be aiming for. Okay, so as I think is well known, there are two ways to build immunity in the population. The first, preferable, is through vaccination, right? And this is, of course, the safe pathway to building immunity. But the second, and important for reasons we've heard already, is through infection with virus, which generates immunity. So both natural, so-called natural infection or infection that derives immunity from the virus or through vaccination will increase the population level immunity. And there are complexities involved with each of these pathways, each way of acquiring immunity. So I want to spend a little time going through each of those in the context of how we measure immunity from each of these kind of pathways. So first of all, let's look at viral infection, right? So-called natural infection, but I prefer to say viral infection. There's nothing particularly unnatural about vaccination in my view. So what are some issues here? Well, first of all, we can't just count how many cases have been reported, because reported cases are such a severe underestimate of how many people have actually been infected, right? There are a couple of reasons for that. First of all is that testing is not always available, and that was particularly a problem, of course, early on in the epidemic, and also that there's a lot of asymptomatic or mild infection. So reported cases are a severe underestimate. As has been discussed, as is well known, immunity from viral infection doesn't provide perfect protection, and it provides different levels of protection against infection and disease. It seems to provide better protection against disease than infection, including asymptomatic infection. And a couple of other features. The way we typically measure immunity in the population is to do so-called seroprevalence studies, to go out to do a study and to see how many people have antibodies, right? But there are situations or complexities in which the level of antibodies in the population will start to kind of decouple from how much immunity is in the population. One example of this, or one phenomenon here, is if there's variant-specific immunity. If you're infected with one type, it provides you, let's say, less protection against another variant of the virus. In this case, the level of antibodies in the community will overestimate immunity, right? Because antibodies aren't providing protection. Flip side of that, converse to that, are waning antibodies. If antibodies are, so first I want to make the point that just because antibodies are waning, it doesn't mean that people are losing immunity. So in this case, which seems to be true for COVID-19, for the SARS-CoV-2 virus, in this case, the level of antibodies we see in the community would underestimate the level of immunity, right? And we think that this is actually quite an important phenomenon for understanding immunity to this virus. It was reported pretty early on that antibodies do wane, and they wane below the level that's normally detected in like typical assays over the order of months for many people, at least. Okay, so this was data from a study on nurses, healthcare workers early on in the US in the pandemic. And so the issue here is that when you go out in the population and you conduct a study or you conduct surveillance and you look at how many people have antibodies, that might not tell you how many people have actually been infected or how many people have immunity. And this is really kind of the mainstay for measuring population immunity from viral infection, at least. In the US, CDC has been conducting these kind of studies by this kind of surveillance by looking at blood samples left over for other clinical purposes. And now they produce very frequent estimates from all 50 US states based on this. But we noticed something, our group noticed something, and probably others as well, early on, which was that over time, this seroprevalence, in other words, the number of people, the percentage of people with antibodies in some states was going down. And that doesn't make sense, of course, if antibodies are supposed to tell you who's been infected at any point in the past, right? This is data from New York, which had a terrible outbreak in the beginning of the pandemic. And, they've had a second wave, cases were accumulating, but antibody prevalence over this time was going down. So what's going on? Well, we think waning antibodies is what's going on, what's explaining this. So we set out to kind of address this problem, and a group of us and a very talented doctoral postdoc in our group developed an approach to adjust for the fact that antibodies are waning. And I think this is important. I'm not going to go into the details of this statistical approach, this algorithm, but I'll show you how we applied it first in a nationally representative study in the US, a study called COVID View that me and my colleagues at Emory led. And basically, we found that about 6% of people, only 6%, had antibodies at the end of October last year. But if you correct for the fact that a lot of people were losing antibodies or their antibodies became undetectable, the true prevalence was about double that. And again, this is before the winter wave last year. About 12% had been infected. And I think this is a phenomenon that's been observed in other studies. Maybe we'll hear about it by Professor Ward in the REACT study in the next talk. Okay, so that's sort of called viral infection, or sometimes called natural infection. Let's look at some of the complexities with vaccination. Many of these are the same. Vaccination, as is well known now, provides imperfect protection. And again, that's different for infection and disease. The vaccine, of course, seems to be better at protecting against disease than more mild infections or even asymptomatic infection. So important to take that into account. There's a time delay too, right? From, as we heard alluded to in the last talk, the time in which someone is vaccinated is not the time that they acquire immunity exactly. There's a delay in the generation of protective immune response. Some people there's people who receive different vaccines, and some people have only received a partial series. Some people have had a complete series, and so there's different level of immunity depending on an individual's vaccination schedule. The nightmare scenario that many of us lose sleep over is a scenario of immune escape, where the virus evolves to escape immunity in the population, and specifically vaccine immunity. Fortunately, that doesn't seem to be a major issue, at least yet. And I think another interesting thing, or important thing that hasn't been talked about very much yet, is who is getting vaccinated based on their immune status. Are people who were previously infected with the virus more or less likely to get vaccinated? If it was people who were not previously infected are more likely to get vaccinated, that actually helps us to achieve population immunity more quickly, because it's this susceptible group that's acquiring immunity through vaccination more quickly. So I've just gone over a whole range of kind of considerations and complexities. I want to now talk about how you can bring some of this information together into a single framework. This is a screenshot from a dashboard that estimates population immunity in the US population. It was developed, we collaborated with Joshua Weitz's group at Georgia Tech, but they really stood this platform up, and you have the link for it here if you'd like to check it out yourself. Basically, what's shown on this figure here is the degree of immunity from natural infection and vaccination in different populations. The x-axis shows the fraction of people infected with the virus, and the y-axis is the fraction of people vaccinated. And so if you follow a given contour, you'll see, for example, this contour here, 80%, over here, 80%. There's different ways to get there, right? You can get there completely through vaccination, or you can get there completely through infection. But of course, the safe way is through vaccination. So in the US, about 80% of people have either been vaccinated or infected to this point. But I'm going to show you two different states here. The first is the one that I'm talking to you from, Georgia. And here we have actually a high degree of people who have been naturally infected, right? Very high levels here of natural infection, and lower levels of people who've acquired immunity through vaccination. If you contrast that with Vermont, there have actually been not many, relatively few infections, but many individuals who have been vaccinated. So the last point I want to make is, what does managing population immunity look like? I think we're in the Delta world now, where I think it's probably unrealistic. If anyone was talking about stopping transmission through either natural infection or vaccination, I think that's probably unrealistic. So I just want to show a contrast between the US and the UK, because I think this highlights this distinction nicely. Both countries have had a winter wave or a fourth wave here. The figure on the top here shows cases, and you can see that probably the UK has actually had higher numbers of cases or higher rate of cases than we had in the US. However, because we've been less successful at vaccinating the most vulnerable populations here, we had much higher mortality in the US than in the UK. So I'll finish there, and I'll just leave up this link to a paper that summarizes a lot of what I have mentioned in the last few minutes. And thank you again for the opportunity of your attention.
Thanks very much, Ben. That was fascinating. So we're moving straight on to Helen Ward, who's going to answer the question, what do we know about population immunity in the UK? Thanks, Helen. I think Ben might be, yeah. You might be on mute, Helen.
No, I'm just, can you hear me now?
Yep, lovely. Nice.
Yeah, sorry, I was just getting my screen up. Okay, so thanks very much. Thanks to the organisers for inviting me to do this. And I think I was a little bit worried that Ben and I would be saying similar things, and I think hopefully we're actually complementary in what we're going to be talking about. So I've been asked to talk about what do we know about population immunity in England, and much as I would love to explore all the theoretical and historical discussions that were set about in the last session, I'm going to try and be disciplined and stick to some data. Okay, so my kind of summary, and I've said the TLDR, it's too long, didn't read, kind of summary of what I'm going to say is what do we know about it in England, about population immunity? And I would say there is not enough yet to control transmission. So that's about, I think, hopefully we can all agree on that, but we have still got quite high levels of transmission. And so the chart at the top here that I've shown is the daily cases, with all the caveats that Ben very elegantly explained, that cases underrepresent the true numbers. But this just shows the cases since the beginning of the pandemic. And so they've fluctuated. You've had big dips, but then it's sort of come back in the middle of 2021 with Delta and continues to fluctuate and go up and down at the moment, despite high levels of vaccination. And the bottom chart here is data that we published last week from the REACT-1 study, the latest round, which was in October, and this is the first part of that round. And so what these are showing is for the aged under 17, 18 to 54 and 55 and over, going from left to right. The prevalence that by day from these randomly sampled people in England. And so in the previous round, in round 14, it was in the younger children, it was still high, but it went much higher in October. And you see a slightly different pattern in the adults and the older adults. But what is important to note is that the absolute prevalence that we found in the middle of October is the highest we've ever recorded in the REACT study since we started, which was in May 2020. And that although most of the transmission and cases appear to be in school-aged children, and also some in the parents of school-aged children, there was a doubling in the prevalence between September and October, suggesting that even in a highly vaccinated population, we are getting high levels of transmission. So yes, to repeat a little of what Ben has said, how do we measure population immunity? And other than looking at whether or not the population incidence is low, the way to measure it is various proxies. You can simply look at the proportion who've been infected or vaccinated, if you have good data on that. or you can look at the proportion who have antibodies. But both of these have limitations, such as the variation and rate of the level of immunity, i.e. what level of protection you get following either infection or vaccination, and how long that persists. And this is a thing that I'm going to come back to later, what level of antibodies actually correlate with protection, which I think is an important question that we need to address when we're looking at trying to measure population immunity. So I've been very closely involved in the REACT-2 part of the REACT study, which was to estimate community prevalence of antibody, specifically to try and get a handle on the cumulative burden of SARS-CoV-2 infection. And we conducted 6 rounds of this between June 2020 and May 2021. Each was a random sample of adults with between 100,000 and over 200,000 people per round. Now, this was a self-test that people did at home, which has its limitations. It's a qualitative test, so you get a positive or a negative result. And it's to the spike protein, therefore it responds to both prior infection and vaccination. And it has a reasonable sensitivity and specificity compared to, initially we compared this to ELISA tests that were carried out on people with known infection, and we did update that following vaccination. And we adjust for that when we estimate prevalence. So the first question really, after that big first wave of infection in March, April 2020, what proportion of people appeared to have been affected? And we carried out our round at the end of June, and we estimated, well, we found 6% prevalence in adults, prevalence of antibodies, which correlated to 3.5 million adults who would have been infected. So after, if you remember back at those times which we heard earlier this afternoon, people are anticipating that after the first wave of infections, maybe, 60, 70, 80% of people would be affected. It looked a lot lower than that. But we did over the next 3 months, so between that late June and September, we had 3 rounds. And in the full cohort, we found a fall of antibody prevalence of 26% over those 3 months. And if you look at this slide, the actual peak of the epidemic was very narrow. So it's not as if there were not that many new cases during that period. So this was waning of people who'd been infected, mostly in April. And that is exactly what Ben's just been talking about. How do you adjust for that? That's a really important finding. So that a snapshot taken in September would grossly underestimate the size of the epidemic in April. So this is the summary results of all 6 rounds. I just wanted to show you. On the right here, you don't need to look at the rest of it really, other than to show these are very large numbers in each round. The prevalence went from 6% to 4.8 to 4.4. And then we had the start of the second wave, and we crept up a little to 5.6 by October. And then January 2021 was 14%. And then May, the last round that we did, was 61%. And obviously this is the result of the combination of the first and second wave and mainly vaccination, which led to that big increase. Again, harking back to some of the earlier discussions, of course, there is no such thing as one level or one threshold. I haven't shown all the data, but this is just data looking at local area, and there's 315 different local areas here where we had the measurements. And you see that the prevalence, this is in February 2021, when the overall prevalence was about 13%. Some areas much higher than others, with over 20, 25, 26%, and others where it was 3% or less, depending on, mostly at that point, on the experience of the epidemic, but also some starting to see some impact of vaccination. Other sources of data in England showed a similar pattern. So this is from the UK Biobank, where 20,000 people, as part of that 500,000 study, were asked to do monthly samples, which were then tested using an ELISA with high sensitivity. And again, in May, 6.6%, and December 8.8%, and the similar variation across the country as we are showing in ours. So common, consistent, a fair way off what anybody would say was a threshold for herd immunity. Now, this slide, very helpfully, the Office for National Statistics has put together data across the whole period up until October of these national prevalence studies. So these turquoise dots here are the REACT study findings that I've just told you about. The dark blue is the coronavirus infection study that ONS carries out, which is a large longitudinal study where they're following people over time. And this is the antibody prevalence that they're showing in these dark blue. And the green is from the blood and transplant collection, which is more similar to the data that Ben described in terms of using routinely collected samples and testing those. And I wanted to just draw attention to two things. One is that the REACT data at each point is lower than the other estimates. So this is our 61%, where at the same time, at the end of May, the other two national ones were over 70%. And that's led to some questioning of the validity of these different methods. But then also from August onwards, in both the coronavirus infection study and the blood and transplant surveillance, almost everybody, over 95% in the blood and transplant and over 90% in the CIS antibody positivity. Now, with over 95% of all adults having that level, you would expect that to equate to herd immunity sufficient to suppress transmission. Just pointing out that, of course, this is very varied by age. And if you look at the over 80s, so these are modelled percentages, with the green of people testing positive for antibodies and the light blue and dark blue 1 and 2 doses of vaccine. But the antibodies should be the sum of it, really. And you're saying that over 80s, 98% of people having antibodies, etc., by October. This contrasts quite a lot with findings in the REACT study, where, so I think the question it raises is, how does this antibody positivity correlate with protection? And is there a difference between the different measures, such as the self-test, the threshold test, and a quantitative ELISA, which is more sensitive? So in
Helen, just if you could finish.
Yeah, I've got 2 more slides. Yeah, antibody positivity since vaccination in our study showed that this along the bottom is time since vaccination, and this was one vaccination. Then after about 5 weeks, you get quite a steep decline in antibody positivity, and particularly in the older age groups. So that would suggest that you're not going to get anywhere near 95% of people with antibodies. So what I wanted to just finish on is, so what do we know? We know that a minority of the population has antibodies, but that's increased to levels consistent theoretically with herd immunity. But we still don't know the relationship of that positivity to protection from infection and transmission. And we don't know what's the useful definition of positivity, really. And maybe we have too sensitive an assay to be useful. So I think future work that we're certainly hoping to do is correlating lateral flow positivity with quantitative titers and with virus neutralization, and to correlate both of these with follow-up for incident cases, hospitalization, death, and long COVID. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed, Helen. That's really clear. We're going to finish this session now with Jake Scott, who's going to talk about what we know about natural immunity from infection and vaccine-induced immunity. So he's going to put it all together. Jake, over to you. And you're on mute, I think.
Okay.
If you could go on.
How's that?
Great, fantastic. Thank you.
Okie doke. All right, well, thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be part of this discussion. I will be touching on what I consider to be highlights of what we currently know and don't know about vaccine and infection-induced immune protection against COVID-19. I do not have any financial conflicts of interest. When thinking about immune protection, it's fundamental that we define it in relation to specific phenomena. Protection against infection is different from protection against disease, the illness caused by infection. Although SARS-CoV-2 is a novel virus, I don't consider it to be an immunological deviant. Much of the immunology that we know so far has been fairly typical. In general, any immunological exposure to SARS-CoV-2, whether it's infection or vaccination, likely leads to protection against subsequent illness. And this exposure can be through a variety of ways. A critical difference, of course, is how that protection is acquired. The price of immunity from infection is often far greater than the price of vaccine-acquired immunity. I've spent a lot of time these past 20 months caring for patients hospitalized with COVID-19, and I certainly don't recommend infection over vaccination if there is a choice. The vast majority of people infected with SARS-CoV-2 develop antibodies, which are typically detected in the blood within 5 to 15 days. Studies have shown big differences in the levels of antibodies among infected individuals, though. Infection usually generates antibodies at both mucosal sites and in the blood. IgG antibodies have been shown to peak within 3 to 5 weeks. And those who suffer from more severe illness have been found to have higher peak levels of antibodies. Studies have shown variation in the duration of antibodies, likely related to differences in immune responses depending on the severity of illness. This study of 215 patients, 34% of whom had severe disease, found that 96% of the individuals had neutralizing antibodies at up to 10 months after symptoms had started. And while there's no established correlate of protection, neutralizing antibodies have been found to show to have a strong correlation with protection against infection. While antibody levels are expected to peak and then decline, the immune system includes other essential components that provide immune memory. This study by Shane Crotty's lab demonstrated that high quality and broad immune memory was maintained for at least 8 months after infection. And based on kinetics, it's expected that immune memory will last multiple years, which is good news. I'll now move on to some of the real-world observational data. There's a massive amount of data, by the way, so I'll quickly go through just a few studies. The Siren study was a prospective study of healthcare workers in the UK. It included around 25,000 individuals in the final analysis who were given tests and questionnaires every 2 weeks. And the study showed that prior SARS-CoV-2 infection was associated with an 84% lower risk of overall infection at 7 months and 93% against symptomatic infection. A large study of 4 million people in Denmark compared patients in their first and second surges and determined that a history of infection conferred 81% protection against subsequent infection with no evidence of waning. A retrospective study of approximately 150,000 healthcare workers in the US showed that those with prior infection had 82% protection against subsequent infection and 85% protection against symptomatic infection. A Qatar study of nearly 200,000 individuals showed 95% protection against subsequent infection at up to 7 months. A study of 15,000 people in Lombardy, Italy, showed a 93% reduction in the risk of subsequent infection. So as you can see, although these studies are different in location and design, the levels of protection provided by infection were quite consistent. The most important caveat to all of this, of course, is that there are often serious risks associated with infection, as we all know, including severe disease and death, transmission to others, and various other consequences. Also, the epidemiologic data are derived from observational studies prior to the Delta era, and many of the studies were completed as vaccination began, so follow-up evaluations have been limited. It's important to note that there's significant heterogeneity and inconsistency when it comes to the various immune responses after infection. This Shane Crotty study showed over 100-fold difference in memory B cell and antibody responses between individuals. So vaccination provides more consistent responses. The breadth of infection-induced protection when it comes to being able to handle certain variants that emerge is more limited. A key example is the Gamma outbreak in Manaus, where high rates of reinfection occurred among a population with a considerable pre-existing natural immunity, which may have been related to a decrease in neutralizing capacity. I'll now shift the focus onto vaccine-induced protection. First, I would argue that the primary goal of a vaccine like this is to prevent serious illness rather than infection. Both, of course, are important. Estimates of protection against infection are more dynamic and vary more, partly due to variations in antibody levels, differences in time since vaccination, intensity of exposure, depending on variants, and levels of virus circulating. This is what's called a forest plot, done by a wonderful group at the International Vaccine Access Center based at Johns Hopkins. And this includes data from various studies of vaccine effectiveness against infection, which shows variation with some wide confidence intervals represented by the horizontal lines. But you can see that a majority of the studies estimated greater than 75% protection against infection, represented by the circles to the right of the yellow vertical line. This figure from a recent high-quality Canadian study done during the Delta era showed that while estimates of protection peaked a bit early on, they remained fairly stable at least until 7 to 8 months. Randomized control data from their phase 3 trial showed that the Moderna vaccine maintained 93% efficacy against COVID-19 at a median of 5 months without any evidence of waning. The Pfizer randomized control trial showed 91% efficacy against infection overall at 6 months and 97% protection against severe disease. They did see some degree of waning against infection. This forest plot illustrates consistently high rates of protection against severe disease provided by various vaccines. High levels of protection against severe disease have also been shown in several real-world studies, now that include data from the Delta era, as shown here in this Canadian study. This is the same figure from the Canadian study, showing remarkable stability and protection against severe disease. These findings have also been shown in other high-quality studies, like this Kaiser study of Moderna effectiveness and this study from England. There's been a lot of concern about waning immunity, understandably, but I do wonder if some of the data were the result of non-immune factors. This large New York State preprint study showed that estimates of vaccine effectiveness declined while the Delta surge started, but then the rates actually plateaued and remained stable. The authors reported that the declines coincided with a rise in Delta and changes in prevention policies, but did not seem to change by time cohort, suggesting that the changes may have been primarily driven by factors other than immunological waning. Declines in vaccine effectiveness during the early part of the Delta surge in the US, soon after masking and distancing were relaxed, followed by a plateau later in the summer, have been reported by other jurisdictions as well, such as this recent data from California. Other studies have shown immunological memory to actually improve over time, with increases in memory B cells, even as antibody levels decline. And most of these memory B cells were able to cross-bind variants of concern, including Delta. Comparing the protection induced by infection to protection compared to induced by vaccination has shown varying results. A recent CDC study showed a roughly 5-fold higher odds of COVID-19 among previously infected individuals versus vaccinated individuals. The UK data showed that vaccination was more protective while the Alpha variant dominated, but the protection was roughly equivalent during the Delta period. And preprint studies from India and Israel have reported that prior infection led to greater protection than vaccination alone. Importantly, though, both of these studies show that the risk of infection was lowest in those who were also vaccinated after infection. There are important immunological differences here. So compared to vaccination, fewer people develop antibodies after infection, especially those who had asymptomatic or mild infection. Peak antibody levels are usually lower after infection, and protection after asymptomatic or mild infection is likely to be inferior to vaccine-induced protection. Also, memory B cells after vaccination have been shown to be qualitatively better at binding variants of concern compared to memory B cells after mild infection. In summary, the evidence has shown that previously infected people are at relatively low risk for reinfection for at least 6 months post-infection. The level of immune protection is typically robust, especially after severe infection, but is not 100%, of course. And not everyone develops an antibody response after infection. The clinical trial and real-world performance of many of our COVID-19 vaccines has fortunately been extraordinary. They provide excellent and durable protection against serious illness, even against variants, and it's imperative that access to them be provided globally. While protection against infection is more variable, we shouldn't forget that some important parts of the immune response improve over time, like a fine wine. In the spirit of this forum, let's take stock of some unknowns, such as the trajectory of waning immunity against infection, challenges posed by emerging variants as it relates to infection and vaccine-induced immune protection, different effects in mucosal versus circulating immunity after infection, and immunological differences in the timing of dosing intervals. It's also unclear what particular antibody levels correlate with protection from infection, how good protective immunity is after asymptomatic or mild infection, and what the longer duration of protection will be, but time will tell. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much, Dave. Sorry, we're running out of time. So I'm going to hand it over to George, who's going to lead the endemicity.
Thanks, Alison. Yes, so our first speaker in this session is Jeff Shaman from Columbia in New York, who's going to talk about when did it become clear that SARS-CoV-2 would become endemic.
Screen and play this. Can everybody see this? I'm going to actually back out and just move something out of the way.
Perfect. Oh.
Wonderful. So I'm going to start off by talking actually about a study that we conducted in New York City prior to the pandemic. This is a study conducted between 2016 and 2018. It was a field study in New York that was trying to see what the true prevalence of infection of common respiratory viruses are. The issue is that most of our surveillance of respiratory viruses prior to the pandemic was really conducted passively. People who manifest with significant symptoms seek clinical care. They're either identified syndromically with something like influenza-like illness, or they're swabbed and they're tested for specific virological agents. We wanted to go out in the community and actually test for infections in an active fashion rather than that passive means that I just described. We had a study called the Virome of Manhattan. It had a number of objectives, one of which was to establish a cohort that ultimately enrolled over 200 individuals over the course of 19 months, including 2 cold and flu seasons. We asked all these individuals to report on a daily basis how they felt with respect to 9 common cold symptoms: sneezing, runny nose, cough, sore throat, etc. They would rate these on a Likert scale: none, mild, moderate, severe. They would also tell us if they'd stayed home from work or school, gone to see a doctor, or taken medicine because of those respiratory symptoms. It's very easy to do. They did this over a phone. It went directly into an electronic database. And we got a daily record of symptomology and how people sought or cared for themselves as a result of the respiratory ailments they experienced symptomatically. Now, in addition, once a week, regardless of how these individuals felt, we swabbed them. We take it back to the lab. We test it for 18 different respiratory viruses. And I'm showing you the results in this table here. We've grouped the viruses by general species, so all the influenzas together, all the RSVs together, et cetera. And we've identified episodes, which are weekly specimens, which are groups of consecutive weekly specimens from a given individual that were positive for the same virus. So if somebody tests positive for several weeks in a row, we're not going to call those multiple infections. It's a single episode of acute respiratory infection by that agent. And as you can see, over the course of these 19 months, we recorded a number of episodes of respiratory infection: 32 for influenza, 275 for human rhinovirus, 137 for the endemic coronaviruses, things like 229E and OC43. Now, the next column, MA, stands for medical attention. And those shows you the number of those people who, during their episodes, because of their symptoms, sought clinical care. And as you can see, it's much less. The next column, which says PMA given VI, is the probability of seeking medical attention given an episode with a respiratory virus. It's simply the MA column divided by the episodes. And what you can see is the fractional numbers are very small. The highest is for influenza. 22% of influenza episodes resulted in an individual seeking clinical care. And it bottoms out on the bottom with the endemic coronaviruses, in which only 4% of those who were infected sought clinical care. So what did this tell us? This told us that the majority of infections due to these respiratory viruses are in fact undocumented. We also could see that a majority of them were asymptomatic by any definition that we could throw at it for symptomatic versus asymptomatic. What it really told us was that there is a much greater prevalence of the viruses than is documented by our passive systems, and that the reason why these common respiratory viruses are common is because the people, when infected with them, do what all of us do when we get a little sniffle or sore throat prior to this pandemic, which was nothing. We would still go to work, we'd still go to school, still go shopping, still go to restaurants. If we have a business trip or a vacation, we'll still get on an airplane. And what are we doing when we do this? We're unwittingly and unknowingly transporting that virus around, taking it to new places and new communities, and passing it on to others. It's this fact that most of the infections are undocumented and mild, if not asymptomatic, yet still contagious, that we believe really allows these viruses to persist and get around as efficiently as they do. So when we saw in January of 2020, the emergence of this coronavirus from its epicenter in Wuhan, and how quickly it spread to cities elsewhere in China, and then hopped on airplanes and went to Thailand and the US and South Korea and Japan, we immediately suspected, having done this study, that it shared a characteristic with common respiratory viruses, that it was producing a lot of undocumented infections, and that people were going around with this virus unknowingly and allowing it to spread and geographically translocate so quickly. So we set up a system to try to test this. We built out a metapopulation model for China during January that represented 375 cities in China for which we had case data. We also used 10-cent travel records on the run-up to the Chunyuan Spring Festival, which was taking place then. It's just location-based services that leverage off of popular apps in China, high penetration in the Chinese markets that allowed us to tell how populations are moving between the cities. We took the metapopulation model representing those 375 cities, we coupled it with the travel data and the observations of case data through data assimilation methods, and we simulated just 14 days, January 10th to January 23rd. And what we're trying to do in this system is we've explicitly represented both documented and undocumented infections. The documented infections are the cases that we have observations of. The undocumented infections are those who never sought clinical care or were tested during that 2-week period. We're also looking to try to estimate how relatively contagious are those two groups, the documented versus the undocumented infectious. So we showed first, and I'm not going to go into this, that the system was indeed identifiable. We did a whole suite of synthetic tests demonstrating that it could actually reproduce and reconstitute appropriate parameters from outbreaks that were generated synthetically. And we then actually addressed it with the real data. So what I want you to focus on here are the estimates of parameters in the less, but in particular, that for the reporting rate, which is the ascertainment rate alpha, and the relative transmission rate mu. Now, the reporting rate tells us what fraction of all the infections are reported, what fraction of infections are cases. And you can see that our estimate is 0.14. We're estimating that only 14% of infections during that time period were documented by the authorities and reported as cases, meaning 86% are undocumented. Furthermore, we found that per person, undocumented infections were roughly half as contagious as the documented infections. We could also aggregate the parameters into a compound parameter to get the reproductive number, and it was in line with early estimates as well that were being produced in January. We took that model estimates and we actually ran simulations, and this just shows you the distribution of simulations of the outbreak growth for that 14-day period nationally in the city of Wuhan, and the number of cities with cumulative incidence of more than 10 cases. The ones in red are with the full parameters that we estimated, and they do indeed match the data that had been produced at that time, so it's a well-fit model. But the blue shows what happens when we take that mu parameter, which is the relative contagiousness of the undocumented infections, and we set it to 0, meaning that they're not capable of spreading the infection. When we do that, the majority of infections that are reported, the majority of cases disappear. In fact, we have nearly an 80% reduction in cases. So what did we conclude from this? Well, unlike SARS-1, we're seeing many undocumented SARS-2 infections, including paucisymptomatic and asymptomatic. Number two, the undocumented infections are responsible for the majority of transmission within China during this 2-week period prior to the lockdown on January 23rd. There was also evidence of pre-symptomatic infection from our model inference. I didn't show that, but that was indeed the case. And what we're seeing is that it has this critical epidemiological characteristic that is consistent with common respiratory viruses. Most of the transmission is taking place among people who are pre-symptomatic, asymptomatic, or paucisymptomatic. They're unaware that they're really contagious with this virus, and they're passing it on to other people. And as a result, we really immediately felt that this virus was not going to be contained. It was not going to be controlled. And the next question was, well, what is, of course, the end result of that? Now, we've seen this over the course of the nearly last 2 years. And certainly the questions that are addressed about what the post-pandemic endemic style of this virus will be have been reflected in the previous discussions on herd immunity. Herd immunity is certainly one of the components of it, and it certainly reflects adaptive immunity, severity of infection, waning of immunity, and immune escape. Interventions are also going to be very important. The vaccines we have, the therapeutics we develop, the seasonality of the virus, whether it's wintertime or summertime, and evidence points to this being wintertime, like the other coronaviruses, at least for temperate regions, it's also going to influence the pattern. And then its interaction with other viruses, including the diversified variants of other strains of this coronavirus that exist. So ultimately, I think the endemic equilibrium, the post-pandemic equilibrium we experience with SARS-CoV-2 is going to depend on a number of critical factors, and just a few. Firstly, the frequency of repeat infections. How often are people being repeatedly infected or experiencing breakthrough infections for the vaccinated? This is going to be a function of immune weighting, immunogenic escape, vaccination types and rates. And the second big question is what is the severity of those repeat infections? This will be a function of immune weighting, immunogenic escape, vaccination efficacy, and therapeutics. Those are going to determine, in aggregate, the long-term infection fatality rate and infection hospitalization rate for SARS-CoV-2. In other words, the numbers of deaths and the numbers of hospitalizations per infection are the key metrics that we really want to look at, because this is going to demonstrate to us how disruptive the virus is in the long term. Is it a severe virus? Is it going to settle into a pattern that looks something like H3N2 upon repeat infections? Or is it going to turn out to be something more benign, like the endemic coronaviruses that don't produce a lot of medically attended infections? So if we look at what it looked like out of the gate.
Can you wrap up, Jeff?
Yeah, last 2 slides.
Yeah.
If we look like what it looked like out of the gate, the infection fatality rate was very high early on. Hospital systems were overwhelmed in places such as New York City, and it exceeded 1% by estimates. If we look at the United States nationally, by the end of the year, it had dropped in this orange line there shown nationally, and then for Los Angeles on the bottom, down to about 0.3%. Now, the IFR for seasonal flu in the US is probably around 0.08%, about 4 times lower than that, depends on H1N1 or H3N2. But I think this is one of the key markers that we will have to follow. Thank you so much.
That was great. Thanks very much indeed, Jeff. We're going to move straight on to Elizabeth Halloran, who's going to talk to us about the transition to endemicity.
Can
right.
you see?
Yeah, we can see that. That's great.
My video, yes. Hello, thank you so much. And I appreciate being one of the last speakers, so I get to summarize a lot of what's been said. I really appreciate being able to take part in this great webinar. I give my acknowledgements up front. This is supported by NIAID, and it comes, we were invited, Rustam Anti and I wrote a paper for immunity that you can see here is the link, that was on the transition from epidemic to endemic. I would also like to say, following on Jeff Shaman, that I actually saw him give that talk in person in mid-February 2020 here in Seattle. And that was the last meeting that I saw any of my colleagues live at. And he predicted what was going to happen. It's been an interesting 21 months. So now my screen is not advancing. There it goes. Okay, transition from epidemic to endemic.
So we go from exponential growth with the R naught greater than 1, say 3 is in a previous talk, to dynamic equilibrium. And I do believe that we are going to have an endemic state unless we find something like an Andromeda strain and Michael Crichton. But the question is, what is the disease burden going to be? And many of the speakers have already addressed this. So people have already talked about, but we've created equations for some of these ideas that immunity can reduce, protect in 3 ways. You can reduce susceptibility to infection, that is called IES, reduces the probability of getting infected. And if a person gets infected, then you can reduce the pathology, that it's the severity of disease, IEP. You can also reduce the infectivity, IEI, the virus transmission from the infected individual, or you can alter the immune boost, the immune efficacy against boosting. And these were ideas that we developed a couple decades ago, and now everybody's quite aware of them, as you saw in some of the previous talks. So for the 4 endemic human coronaviruses, we do not have quantitative measurements for the 3 immune efficacies, but we do have qualitative evidence. And you've seen some of that already today. The immunity to infection wanes, that is, people get reinfected. So that means the immune efficacy to susceptibility is less than 1. There's virtually no severe disease, and transmission from secondary infections are likely reduced. And that is based on some modeling results. So the consequences for COVID-19 is that the protection against infection likely wanes more quickly than against disease. And on this graph from our paper, you can see the time after infection in years on the x-axis and the immune efficacy on the y-axis, and the red line is the immune efficacy against infection, and we see it here waning faster than the blue line, which is the immune efficacy against pathology or against disease, which could be also death. And so in that region, between the IES and the IEP, we could imagine people can get infected and have their immunity boosted. And we also see, and if you get repeat infection and you get your immunity against disease boosted, then it might be also good to keep the transmission in the population up. So then the question is whether at primary versus secondary infection. And at the beginning of the pandemic, everyone had no previous exposure to SARS-CoV-2, and all ages of people got primary first infections. Severe disease, hospitalization, and death were much more common in older people. But the primary infection in younger people is on average much less severe, and I'm careful to say it's less severe because we all know there's severe illness in children and also deaths. So will secondary infections be less severe? So the transition to the endemic phase. Over time, the percentage of primary infections in young children will increase. And here on this graph, we see in the x-axis again, the time in years and the number of infected on the right y-axis. And it's again this epidemic curve followed by the endemic curve, and the dotted line represents the percentage of primary infections that are in children. So as that increases, and if children have less severe disease, we would expect less severe disease as the population goes forward in time. So another concept that has come up is antigenic drift shift versus fitness. So far, the virus evolution current variants of concern, for example, Delta, have shown a great increase in fitness. They're more transmissible. But so far, there's less evidence for immune evasion through antigenic drift or shift. The consequences for vaccination: will an updated SARS-CoV-2 vaccine need to deal with the antigenically different strains as with influenza? Will the disease burden of COVID-19 become similar or greater or smaller than that of influenza, living with many thousands of hospitalization and deaths each year? And what's good news is that so far the COVID-19 vaccines seem more efficacious than influenza vaccines. So unknowns and uncertainties. What will endemicity look like? Will secondary and later infections be less severe? What is the effect of immune boosting on disease burden in the population? What is the relative rate of waning and boosting of different aspects of immunity? What is the potential change in age-dependent severity? That is, could the virus mutate in a way that it actually causes more severe disease in children? So the primary infections in children become more severe. And I mentioned here animal reservoirs, which is not the topic of this symposium, but it's breaking news in the US that a lot of the white-tailed deer are infected, actively infected with SARS-CoV-2. So for vaccination, how often must one vaccinate to maintain immune protection? And what is the effect of virus variants for updating COVID-19 vaccines during the endemic phase? So with that, I close. Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to speak.
That's great. Thanks very much indeed, Elizabeth. I'm going to pass over to Fiona, who's going to chair the last session.
Thank you so much, George, and thanks for that great session, everyone. I'm aware that we are running a bit behind time, but we will move on. And I was just saying that we will hopefully have some time for questions, but please do, if you're panelists, look into the Q&A and answer what questions you can see there, because I know people would appreciate, there's some fantastic questions coming through. So we'll make sure that questions that have come into the chat are pushed onto the Q&A, and then if you could answer them in live time, that would be really, really fabulous. So we're moving on to a futures-facing session, global perspectives and the future. And the first of our speakers is Helen Godlee, who is going to speak about the situation in South Asia, speaking from the National University of Singapore. Helena, over to you.
Many thanks, Fiona, and good afternoon to everybody. I'm aware we are running late, so I'll try to go a bit faster. So as you see there from my title, I'm based in 2 institutions. I was very lucky to I'm based in Singapore, but also in the UK. So I was lucky to have this perspective in terms of exploring the experiences in Asia, but also being able to compare it with some of the strategies in Europe. And I have to admit that at many times it was quite frustrating. So here I'm just going to highlight quickly the situation right now in some of the Asian countries that I'm going to focus on. And you will see that most of these countries have followed an elimination or aggressive containment strategy, and they've done quite well throughout the first year. And now the second year, everybody's arguing, what do they do next? Of course, vaccination has been a challenge in some of them, but you will see here the case of Singapore, which is actually where I'm based. And I want to discuss it because I think it's a perfect case study in terms of what we're going now forwards into the future and some of the challenges that these countries are currently facing. So you see this has been a spike in cases. Singapore did very well, but they've decided to transition towards endemicity. And we'll discuss now what it means and what strategies have been implemented in practice. When we look at vaccination, I think overall, it was not such a great success. While most of these countries, Australia, China, Hong Kong, New Zealand, Singapore, and South Korea, everybody would agree that they did quite well during the first year. I think with vaccinations, they were rather slower than some of the European countries, but I think they've managed to catch up with some exceptions like Hong Kong. And here, one of the challenges when we look at the differences between regions also, just to give you an example, in Singapore, one of the key challenges was that the elderly population did not want to get vaccinated, particularly the 70s and above 80s, because they did not see it as a risk, because there had been so little infections among this group. So this is for you to take into account the differences in regions. One of the key aspects when I was working in Singapore, and here my dean was very key on that, he was already in December, he asked me if I could move all my team to do research on COVID. And one of his main challenges was that he thought, or he preempted that high performing health systems will not be ready for COVID-19. And it was this assumption at the beginning that most African countries were going to suffer, but already in Asia, we had the suspicion that maybe it was going to be a global phenomenon. And here you see the first paper that we published. It was learning from Hong Kong, Japan, and Singapore. What could other countries learn? And you see the publication date. In December, we already started working on this. And our obsession, or our kind of idea, was that we wanted to document what was happening in Asia as rapid as possibly, because we thought other countries could learn some lessons. And here, for example, you've got a small commentary on Taiwan, but I think this is one of the countries that has been very little explored and that had implemented key strategies at the beginning of the pandemic. And also we did a comparison between Europe and Asian Pacific, also in the opening and easing restrictions, and some lessons that we thought European countries could learn from Asian countries. So one of the key aspects, and I think it hasn't been emphasized sufficiently during the pandemic, is preparedness. So many Asian countries and also African countries, I have to say, they were already prepared because they had experienced other pandemics or outbreaks like SARS or MERS or Ebola in Africa. And I want to highlight here that Singapore does sort of conducts drilling exercises, and they were very much prepared, and they did drilling exercises in hospitals. They had equipment for protective equipment for 6 months, and also they did drilling exercises in the country. And the idea with these drilling exercises at hospital level was to be able to also introduce a contact tracing system within 24 hours, which was not the case in most of European countries. So here I'm just going to zoom in into Singapore, and then I'll zoom out into the other countries. So very quickly in Singapore, the task force was introduced one day before the first case study was identified. So very early on, they decided to move on. Singapore had already an infectious disease center, and that was instaurated because of SARS. So specifically for this type of situations, and also with the research and key experts and a 300-bed facility to be used whenever was needed. So these are the areas that had already been introduced through the experience of SARS. Again, with contact tracing, before we had the first case, all my students, public health students, they were like, Elena, we need to start working with the ministry to establish the contact tracing system. And we are very much aware that this is going to be an issue and we need to start as soon as possible. So for me, the key balance or the key when you compare with Europe or the US or with Asian countries was this readiness, the fact that they were very fast to act, and that they already knew in a way how to implement basic public health measures that seem to have been forgotten in other countries. And of course, they also used the new technologies which they made available for other countries. And arguably, some of them we could discuss later on, some of the QR codes, perhaps infringing in what some countries would consider their liberties. So this is to discuss in terms of what is appropriate or not. After doing this work with the Asian countries, it's also important to highlight that through the independent panel for WHO, we conducted some work with 28 countries. And here to highlight that when looking at Asian countries, it was very clear that they had performed better the first year together with the African countries. So here was also a key message in terms of perhaps European countries have been a bit more humble and have tried to learn from other countries, which we think has been missing during the pandemic. When looking at the countries in Asia that now zooming out a bit, so looking at Vietnam, Thailand, Singapore, we've seen that these countries, they have some common approaches that have made them successful for the first year. I'm not going to go into detail through all of them, but key was prior experiences, as I've said, listening to the science, having the appropriate leadership, leadership that was trusted by the population, and a strong public health and health service delivery system. And when they did not have public health strong systems like New Zealand, they acted promptly and they all worked in a coordinated manner. So these were key strategies. And finally, very, very important, social and economic supports to be able to comply with public health measures. When we look at public health measures, here there is a combination of the ones that have been successful in Asian countries that I've mentioned, but one that has not been so much highlighted in Europe, and I would like to highlight here, is the issue of having quarantine and isolation facilities and providing the economic support for those groups that they were most vulnerable. Very important and not so much conducted in European countries. Then, of course, moving now into the future and key areas, when we look at the strengths and weaknesses of aggressive containment, I think it's important to mention that there are some benefits. Of course, the first year, low mortality and suggestions that quicker economic recovery. But of course, some of the challenges is that it requires much more in terms of financing. And also what I've mentioned before in terms of restricting civil liberties, that there's been some criticisms of that in some of the countries. And now moving into endemicity, I think I wanted to read this quote because it's quite illustrative of what is happening now in Singapore. So this is from the Minister of Finance. The path towards being a COVID resilient nation is going to be a hard slog. even with vaccination rates are very high, because we're not going to reach herd immunity where the outbreaks just fizzle out. So the idea is that we're going to be filling the stones as we cross the river. This has been quite surprising, this new approach in Singapore, but in a way is during the first year, strict measures, going for near elimination, high vaccination, and now they're opening up the country, and they're very much aware that they're going to have a surge in cases. But the way to control that, the long road to endemicity, the idea that what they want to do now is to have flexible non-public health interventions, and they have to be very targeted, and they have to be able to be putting them in practice when they have an outbreak. Of course, they want to have maximum vaccination coverage, and they want to involve much more the community in terms of taking responsibility and being able to help with the surveillance and some of the measures. And finally, the idea is to reduce health systems, to reduce inequalities, and to reinforce the lasting pandemic preparedness. And my final slide is just to reflect quickly on the idea that when we've looked at strategies, right now we are in the reacting phase, where we're looking at the public health measures, risk communication, and we are very much aware, and this is through the work with the independent panel and WHO that tasked us to find the recommendations on how we move forward on the pandemic, that we see it as an iceberg. Right now, we are tackling the top of the iceberg, but the issues that we need to work with looking into the future is we need to be able to anticipate. And by here, I think one of the key messages is we need to really learn from other countries. I think we haven't done this enough. We also need to evaluate our responses. I think countries have been very weak on that. Of course, we need to design the new systems, and we're all working towards that. How do we improve primary healthcare, people-centered approaches? And the most difficult, and at the bottom of the iceberg, is how do we actually build more equitable societies, which we know that the inequalities have exacerbated with COVID, and they are very much aware, and we believe that this is now the right time to tackle them because it has come to the surface, but these are the ones that they will be more difficult to address. And on that note, I hand over to Fiona again. Many thanks.
Helena, thank you so much. That was absolutely masterly. Thank you. Wonderful. Our penultimate speaker then is Amanda Kvalsvig, who's speaking from New Zealand, Otago University. And Amanda, thank you so much. We know it's an early start for you, but over to you.
Greetings from New Zealand. I'm Amanda Kvalsvig. I'm an epidemiologist at the University of Otago, Wellington. Because I'm deaf, I've pre-recorded my talk. I'm going to move to my slides now. Here we go. My talk's got 4 main points. I'm going to talk about the past, present, and future of population immunity in New Zealand. And along the way, I'm going to stop and talk about the problem of averages when thinking about population immunity. Starting with our history, a long time ago, in 1913, a missionary became infected with smallpox while traveling to New Zealand. He then attended a mass gathering and triggered a super spreading event. The resulting outbreak was eventually stopped by a mass vaccination program, but over 2,000 people became infected, an enormous number given the small population of the time, and many died. Most of those cases and deaths were Maori. That was 1913, and only 5 years later, in 1918, pandemic influenza arrived in New Zealand, and once more there were poor outcomes for Maori, with mortality rates approaching 8 times that of non-Maori. So you can see 2 recurring strands in our history. The first is introduction of an infectious disease into a largely or perhaps completely susceptible population. And secondly, multiple mechanisms amplify risks in populations that are structurally disadvantaged. And in New Zealand, that is particularly Maori and Pacific peoples. That's a common experience in colonized nations. So when COVID-19 arrived, we knew that we didn't want history to repeat itself. And this recurring pattern was a key consideration in the decision to adopt an elimination strategy in March 2020. back to the present, this cartoon is feeling a little close to the bone just now. So once again, we have a susceptible population, but until now, that's not really been a problem because we've had virtually no transmission. We've had very low case numbers. We've had 32 deaths in the pandemic so far. That's orders of magnitude lower than in many other places. However, in August 2021, a large Delta variant outbreak commenced in New Zealand, and that's still going on because in September, New Zealand began to transition away from its elimination strategy. So what we have now is that immunity to COVID-19 is generated almost completely by vaccination, not disease, in New Zealand. We're using the Pfizer vaccine, and initially we had some supply issues. So you can see rollout was very slow and constrained in the first half of this year. And when that problem was resolved, uptake was very rapid. We're now up to 79% fully vaccinated, and that looks great. And it is great, but there are a couple of caveats on that. So as I mentioned, I was going to talk about averages. Looking at those pictures, New Zealand has a famously low population density. But when you look at these two images, you can see that looking at the average population density across the whole country doesn't tell you very much about outbreak risk in any particular area. And in fact, the New Zealand population is highly urbanized, and a third of the population live in just one city, the Auckland urban region. Auckland is crowded and it has high inequities. When you look at the ethnicity distribution in Auckland, you can see that any assumptions of homogeneous mixing in calculating herd immunity thresholds or modeling outbreaks, those assumptions would not hold for this city. And you can also see that if there are differences by ethnicity in vaccine uptake, that could be a problem. And indeed, that is the case. When you look at that graph on the right, you can see quite a large spread. And you can see that Māori have the lowest vaccine uptake of the main ethnicity groups. The second point to make on this slide is what a difference a denominator can make. That nice figure of 79% vaccinated is only of the eligible population. In fact, it translates into 66% of the total New Zealand population, 58% of the Māori population. And that's important because Māori carry so much risk in this pandemic. They once again are contributing disproportionately to the case burden. So it's a complex picture, but we have inequities in health delivery, and we have differences in age by ethnicity structure in the population, and multiple other inequities all coming together to form a perfect storm. So just to labor that point a little more, we need to know the vaccine proportion in the whole population because that is the susceptible population. And secondly, that the overall proportion vaccinated conceals within it large differences by age and ethnicity. So looking ahead, most adult New Zealanders will be vaccinated when they encounter the SARS virus for the first time, but vaccine coverage is very unequal. New Zealand's elimination strategy has served it well, but history is repeating. For that reason, herd immunity and living with the virus narratives are highly problematic here because they raise the question of who is going to live with the virus and who is going to make that decision on their behalf. So our policy priorities are around protecting those most at risk, addressing the inequities in vaccination, generating layered protection that uses vaccination but also uses public health and social measures, and making a very rapid decision on vaccinating 5 to 11-year-olds. In terms of research, there's some interesting opportunities here from our unique pandemic course. We also have good data infrastructure in New Zealand. And what that means is that we can effectively study the whole New Zealand population as a longitudinal cohort. Very importantly, we need Māori-led research and an increased research workforce. They hold the key to breaking New Zealand's recurring pattern of inequitable impacts. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Amanda. Really great. We're going to move on then to our final speaker for this webinar. Shahid Jamil from Oxford University is going to talk about the Indian subcontinent. Shahid.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Let me share the slides and get on with it quickly. Yeah, so I was asked to speak about the Indian subcontinent. And these two graphs tell you the picture here. If you look at the subcontinent and the 4 countries that had the maximum number of infections, India predominates. And being a large country with almost 1.4 billion people, with an infection rate of almost 25,000 per million, that's a lot of cases. On the second graph, you can see India is removed from that graph. And then you begin to see how the other countries fare in this, Bangladesh, Pakistan, and Nepal. Sorry, I should go on the view mode. If we put this in the perspective of the global data, this graph shows you the daily cases globally. About 250 million cases and about 5 million deaths. And if you compare India and the other 3 countries that have shown the highest number of cases, you find that India has the 2nd highest number of cases and the 3rd highest number of COVID deaths in the world. And this is sort of how the graph moved. We had 2 very clearly defined waves, the first wave and the second wave. And the second wave was humongous. At peak, we were getting roughly 400,000 confirmed cases per day in this outbreak. Of course, like everywhere else in the world that suffered from this, in India also, we saw a lack of leadership and adherence to science, which led us into many problems. Let me give you a timeline for the pandemic that happened in India. India went through its first nationwide lockdown when we had only 657 cases and 12 deaths. And this was a very strict lockdown over 68 days, which definitely slowed down the early rise of infection, but it caused a lot of off-target effects, which meant that there was a lot of loss of livelihoods. Since a lot of Indians work in the non-organized sector, people started moving away from cities into villages. And that took the infection, which was initially just an urban phenomenon, into the rural areas. As we went through the first wave and things started going down for about 5 months, in the months of December and January, there were a lot of weddings and other private events, which to some extent served as super spreader events. You have to look at this in the context of the B1617 variant that was first seen in Western India. And this, I should remind you, is the precursor to the Delta variant. And then what we today know as Delta was first seen in February 2021. And it really caused the big second wave that we saw. However, despite warnings from the scientific community, state elections went on. state and local elections went on during that critical 1 month period. And another super spreader event, which is the religious festival Kumbh Mela, went on, almost overlapping the state elections. And that really, these two super spreader events, preceded by the private events, really fueled the second wave for the country. And if you look at the vaccination rates during our second wave, shown here in the red graph, you find that less than 10% people had 1 dose of vaccine by the time the second wave had peaked. And in fact, much less before, by the time the second wave arrived. So super spreader events, low levels of vaccination is what caused this. Well, if you track variants of concern, and again, I'm putting variants of concern on the same graph, you will see that it's the Delta variant, almost completely the Delta variant, which was responsible for this infections in India. There is certainly Delta is also varying into other lineages, the AY lineages, which are collectively known as Delta plus, and that's the situation as of now. Just like everywhere else in the world, India also undercounted deaths. It's a matter of by what factor, and these are two graphs. The top graph shows you the actual data, and the bottom graph shows you the excess death based on death registries, crematoria, graveyards, etc. And it turns out that in India, if you look at this at the bottom, the official estimate versus the predicted estimate was about 9 times. So we had roughly 9 times more people dying than was actually shown in official registries. There were 4 sero surveys conducted in India, shown again on this graph of the 2 waves. And here are the results. The first sero survey, done between May and June 2020, showed only 0.7%. And I might add that each of these sero surveys were conducted on about 28,000 people in 70 districts across the country. India has about 700 districts, so about 10% of the districts in the country. So it was a fairly representative population, both urban and rural. So the first sero survey, 0.7%. The second sero survey, August and September, rose tenfold to about 7%. The third sero survey done in the downward phase here showed 24% Indians had IgG antibodies. And finally, the fourth sero survey done after the second wave was over showed that over 2/3 of Indians had been exposed to the virus. And by this time, there was not enough vaccination. So the IgG is mainly coming from infections. There is little contribution of vaccination. If you also look at disaggregated data, you will find that children were almost as much infected as adults. And mind you, the schools were all closed during this entire period. So this also told us that the transmission was largely in home settings and not in school settings. There was no difference in male, female, urban, rural. More recent data, looking at the entire country, and the numbers that you see are percentage of seropositivity across different states of India. And the colors that you see are the test positivity rates. So the outbreak was still happening in September in certain parts of the country, especially Kerala, parts of Maharashtra and the Northeast. And seroprevalence data showed that all of these states showed low seroprevalence early on in the pandemic. So they did very well. They protected their citizens very well, but they couldn't finally deal with the onslaught of Delta and the COVID fatigue that had set in. If you look at the capital city of Delhi and the surrounding areas, most recent sero survey from Delhi shows that 97% people have antibodies to SARS coronavirus 2. Mumbai also similar, somewhere in the range of 85 to 90%. One final thing about South Asia, and there is this new study from Oxford that shows that there is a gene variant in South Asian people that doubles the risk of COVID death. Of course, the last line has not been written on it because some people have questioned this study. Although this study shows a gene called LZTFL1, which is possibly a restriction factor, allows, prevents the virus getting into epithelial cells. And the variant that is found in South Asian people doesn't prevent the virus entering as well. So I will close there, and if there are any questions, happy to answer.
Wonderful, thank you so much, Shahid. That was really fascinating. Right, we are at 6:30. We've come to the end of our talks. I want to thank the speakers and all of the participants who've been fielding these, sending us a lot of questions. We won't be able to get through nearly all of them, but Alison is going to kindly feed through and I will field them to the remaining panelists. Alison.
Okay, this is one probably for all the panelists, and it's in two parts. The first is the strategy of going for over 75% vaccination of the population a good one when natural immunity contributes to the herd immunity threshold? And probably the second part, if you want, is, well, maybe we'll deal with that one first.
Yes. Would everyone like to turn those who are here, turn their cameras on, then I can see who's around. Who would like to have a go at that one? I'm going to ask Jeff. Does that seem like a question you'd like to answer?
Well, I mean, I have an opinion about this. I'm not sure if it's the most informed opinion, but I think what you're really looking for is a combination of vaccination and natural infection to get people past the hurdle of having their first exposure to something and developing some sort of antigenic profile that helps you against COVID. But the landscape is changing continually. We obviously have had a Delta variant that has jumped us. It's changed the transmissibility of the virus, its immunogenicity, its virulence has shifted, and we don't know what other kind of variants are going to come down the road in subsequent months. So it's sort of a wait and see perspective. I would also really stress on an individual level, clinically, that vaccination is a very effective way of protecting yourself because it strongly protects against severe, critical, and fatal disease. And from that perspective, even if it's not sterilizing immunity, even if it's not stopping onward transmission and infection amongst individuals who are vaccinated, it is shown over and over again, particularly the mRNA vaccines, that it is highly effective at preventing the more severe or reducing the risk for the more severe clinical outcomes.
Thank you very much, Jeff. Alison, could you type the question for Amanda, who says she can stay for questions? But or was that already in the type? Meanwhile, I'll just ask Elizabeth, because I saw Elizabeth nodding while Jeff was speaking. But Amanda, coming to you in a moment.
You're asking, is this me? You're asking me?
Yeah, Elizabeth, go, yes, do.
Yes, well, no, I agree with Jeff. And I think that we're very lucky to have these marvelously wonderful vaccines that are highly effective against hospitalization and death. I don't know that giving a number is 75%, 80% is really useful, but to try to get people to have some immunity, either through natural infection, but better through vaccination, to get them to the point where if they get infected, then they likely won't have severe disease, hospitalization, or death. So I don't believe in these numbers. I'm also not a believer in numbers.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Amanda, did you get the question?
Yes, I did. Should countries push for a one-size-fits-all approach? Is that the one I'm answering?
That's it.
Yes. That's an interesting question for us here in New Zealand, because we have such a different situation and we actually have very little natural immunity. Our perspective from here has been, as I think I said in my talk, because of our very poor track record of very high inequities and impacts on our indigenous populations, we really haven't wanted to let this infection transmit right through the community. We already know that that would have very severe consequences. So in a sense, that's not a decision that we have wanted to make. And the decision may be taken from us in the sense that community transmission is picking up in New Zealand, and we are not going to achieve very, very high levels of vaccination before that happens. So I think that's probably enough for me.
That's very much. Shahid, do you want to talk about the situation in South Asia?
Sorry, is that to me?
Yes, to you, Shahid.
What was the question? I missed it.
Alison, just repeat the question.
Really, is a one-size-fits-all, going for very high levels of vaccination, over 75, 80, whatever, 90%, useful when we should be taking into account natural immunity, that contribution to herd immunity?
Certainly. I mean, the question always is, do you test people to see if they have pre-existing antibodies, or do you vaccinate without testing? If you test, then in a large country such as India, that becomes another step. It's more expensive to test than to give the vaccine. So I think countries like that have decided they're going to vaccinate as many people as they can without first testing them. I mean, if you're a small country with a lot of resources, you can do that. But vaccinating 1.3 billion people, and then on top of that, testing that many people adds another level of complexity.
Thank you, Alison.
And I may add that we don't even know what the correlates of protection is. What levels of antibodies protect?
So Thomas has his hand up.
Well, if we're being invited to opine, I think there's an opinion that has to come out here, which is the just grotesque nature of global inequity in vaccine distribution. That I think for many countries, any individual country's perspective, getting lots of vaccines delivered is always going to be a good thing because they're incredibly safe and effective. But it is just obscene that it's been described as hoarding by Maddie Pye very prominently and others, and I think there's no other word for it. It's obscene, the inequity that's been allowed to persist, particularly when the AstraZeneca and so on was developed explicitly on a kind of non-profit basis, and that's I just think has to be said. I think we can opine on technical issues, but just from a basic point of human morality, the lack of, people say it's all the same excuses you get. It doesn't matter much in the Indian population because it's 1 billion. Well, you start with the oldest bit of that population and work down, and you have such extreme returns on getting the very oldest vaccinated. It's not true that you have to get 1 billion doses out to make a big difference to mortality.
Thanks, Thomas.
So here's a wider question. Is it wise use of resources to go for this mass vaccination of everybody? And we look like we're going to be doing it annually, perhaps, when other diseases kill so many more people every year and receive collectively 1/10 of the funding. I don't know where that figure comes from, but it was in the question. So is this an appropriate priority compared with all the other diseases, TB, malaria, etc.? Maybe you don't feel in a position to answer that.
Does anyone want to tackle that one? Historians amongst you. David. You'll have to go off mute, sorry.
Can't believe we're still doing that. So I would like to say about that, I remember there was an article in Forbes, which I did not read before the coronavirus pandemic, it was titled something along the lines of the one statistic you have to read: 40% of deaths in the US are in 0.6% of the US population. And it was about care home deaths. And so I always think about it that way. I mean, I think about, we talk about these thresholds that we have to hit, But even if the threshold for coronavirus is, say it's as high as 85%, like even if we hit that, if that percentage isn't, if the immune people are not the people in the care homes or the people working in care homes, then does it really matter? It doesn't, it's not going to have any impact. Like there's still going to be spread of coronavirus in care homes. So,
okay.
Alison.
So a question now to Elizabeth, if you could answer quickly, because I've got a number of others. Is there any evidence that the deer in the US that you were talking about transmit to humans, or that animals infected elsewhere? You'll have heard of the mink scandal in Denmark, which resulted in resignation, actually transmits to humans. Do we know?
Well, the answer is I don't know. And in the news, this just broke in the news the last 2 days here in the US with the deer. And there is no evidence that they're transmitting to humans yet.
Okay, thank you. Okay, this is from Burkina Faso, a question, where she's saying that yesterday they had only 178 cases in a population of 20 million. The pandemic started it's had 234 deaths in total. Do the panelists think they should embark on mass vaccination? And if so, what should be the target? And if you'd answer that very quickly, because I've got some more questions.
Who's going to take that one? George, feeling? No.
Well, I referred in the thing to, there is this excellent work going on in the respiratory group at Cymru Welcome, and I think there might be interesting people there to comment on it, because it's a very, very different situation in Africa because the ages are so young. But I think the age still comes out as worth doing because it's, you know, if you can get the over 60s.
Thanks. This is a question for Ben, Helen, and Jake. Multiple studies have suggested there is pre-existing immunity in the population. Here, they've put in brackets, likely from infection from other circulating coronaviruses, although that's been, how should we include this information in our assessment of herd immunity?
I have to say that both Ben, Helen, and Jacob all had to leave for various reasons.
Does anybody want to answer that one?
Maybe I could say a few words about it. In fact, the literature on previous immunity, or the role of previous immunity, is not very convincing. There is no cross-reaction really well demonstrated for antibody specificity. And as far as T cells are concerned, as I showed you on one of my slides, there's no data as well. So there was initially a paper showing a T cell cross-reaction with previous coronavirus infections, but this has to be confirmed.
Thank you. Question for...
I'm sorry. I was just going to say on that, there's an interesting, although very preliminary, randomized controlled trial with BCG vaccination suggesting possible protection, and there's much larger trials underway.
That takes us to another subject, which is the influence of a non-specific effect of a given infection for another infection, because there are many, typically infections may modulate the immune responses independently of their specificity for a given virus. This is typically shown when you see that a high level of infections will protect from allergic and autoimmune disease. So it's a complex problem, but BCG is of course one of the major immunological immune modifiers. So it's interesting, but it's not through cross-reaction.
David.
Yeah, I'd just like to say, I mean, I saw the paper from Francois Ballou at UCL about, was it 4 months ago? That I thought it was pretty much established that there is cross-immunity with other coronaviruses. The question is the extent. And also I thought in previous papers by Shane Crotty had sort of also established that there was pre-existing immunity in the population. The question was the extent to which it existed.
Jean-Francois, do you want to answer that one? Okay.
Alison, I think one last question. What is your killer question?
Oh gosh, let me.
I think the questions have been, you know, available, and people have been answering them as we've gone, haven't they? So, but I guess just a message to anyone who wants to ask further questions. You're welcome to respond via the bmj.com rapid responses, and we can pass them on. That's the best I can suggest at the moment.
Okay, well, actually, we're pretty much done, Fee, but there is one for Prof. Bach here, saying, the speaker wasn't clear whether you were saying vaccination against SARS-CoV-2 gives partial immunity in the mucous membranes of the upper respiratory tract, thus preventing transmission.
Well, this is a very important question. I am aware of data concerning influenza vaccines, which show IgA production in the respiratory tract. I'm not aware of such data for SARS-CoV-2, but maybe they exist. I do not know the whole literature, the vast literature on the subject, but as far as I know, I've not seen any data. It should be relatively easy to test, just looking at the IgA antibodies in the nose, but I don't know if it has been done. But in influenza, it is present, so it's really very interesting hypothesis that there is some effect. Now, that being said, as we all know, vaccines do not fully protect against transmission. So if there is local immunity, it's imperfect.
That's a good unknown to end with, isn't it? Anybody else want to contribute there before we? That's it.
Thank you so much, Alison. Thank you, George. Thank you to our panelists, and for those of you who've managed to stay on beyond the time. And many thanks to you who have been listening. I think we've succeeded in shedding light, but remaining clear about some of the uncertainties in this very complex area, and really delighted to have you all with us. Please do, when you receive the message about this webinar, feel free to share the link widely. It'll be available on YouTube.